I stepped into the Virginia family courtroom wearing my formal military uniform. The medals on my chest caught the harsh overhead lights. My father chuckled under his breath, while my mother looked away in exaggerated disappointment. The judge adjusted his glasses and stared down from his bench. The entire room fell completely silent. Every single eye was fixed on the woman they believed was fundamentally broken. That was the moment they sealed their own absolute destruction, because no one in that room had any idea who I truly was. My name is Jocelyn. I am 33 years old and serving as a major in the United States Army specializing in cyber intelligence. For my entire adult life, my family treated me like a pathetic failure who ran away to the military just to avoid real corporate work. Today, they dragged me into court to legally strip away the only thing my grandfather ever left me. Before I dive deeper into this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to face down toxic relatives who severely underestimated your intelligence and your worth. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom had barely closed behind me when the attacks began. I sat straight and perfectly still at the defense table. Across the aisle sat the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My father, Harrison, was 62 years old and a real estate contractor whose arrogance was matched only by his rapidly failing business portfolio. Beside him sat my mother, Vivian. She was a 60-year-old suburban socialite who cared more about maintaining a flawless image at her exclusive country club than she ever cared about my actual well-being. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Harrison kept his head bowed. He rubbed his temples as if carrying the heavy burden of a tragic father. Vivian clutched a lace handkerchief. She produced perfectly timed sniffles whenever the judge glanced in her direction. The real mastermind of this legal circus was pacing the floor in front of the judge. Elijah was my 34-year-old brother-in-law. He was a sharp-talking African-American wealth management lawyer with a custom-tailored suit and a massive ego. He had married my younger sister Courtney 5 years ago. Together they formed a partnership of pure greed. Elijah held up a thick stack of documents and slammed them onto the podium for dramatic effect. "Your Honor," Elijah said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We are not here out of malice. We are here out of deep family concern. My sister-in-law Jocelyn has served our country, but unfortunately the extreme trauma of her military service has left her mentally incapacitated. We are formally petitioning for immediate conservatorship over her estate due to severe and untreated post-traumatic stress disorder." I kept my face entirely blank, but internally my blood boiled. I glanced at my 29-year-old sister Courtney. She was the golden child of the family. She called herself a luxury interior designer, but everyone knew she just spent our parents' money buying overpriced furniture for her own house. Courtney offered me a sad, pitying look across the room, but I could see the greedy smirk hiding just beneath the surface. They did not care about my mental health. They did not care about my military service. They only cared about one thing: the 500 acres of barren land in rural Virginia that my grandfather had bypassed them to leave directly to me. For years they mocked that dirt as a worthless inheritance. But now that Harrison was drowning in bad bank debt, that land was their only lifeline. The courtroom was quiet enough that I could hear my mother Vivian whispering to the senior partner Elijah had brought along as co-counsel. Her voice carried that familiar tone of absolute disgust she always reserved for me. "I told her not to do it," Vivian hissed loudly enough for the court reporter to hear. "She refused to go to a proper business school. She ran off to hide in the army just to earn starvation wages. We tried to give her a good life, but she threw it away. Now look at her. She is unstable and hoarding that land for no reason. We need the court to transfer the deed to Courtney. Courtney has a brilliant vision to develop a luxury wellness resort there. It is the only way to save our family company from going under because Jocelyn is too sick to manage her own affairs." Hearing those words felt like a physical blow, even though I had anticipated them. My entire childhood was defined by that exact narrative. Nothing I did was ever prestigious enough for their gossip circle. When I scored in the top percentile for cybersecurity and encryption, Harrison laughed and asked why I wanted to be a glorified computer mechanic. When I earned my commission as an officer, Vivian complained that the uniform made me look masculine and asked why I could not just marry a hedge fund manager like Courtney did. They spent decades gaslighting me, telling me my achievements were failures. Now they were attempting to use the legal system to declare me mentally unfit. Elijah handed the judge a fake psychological evaluation he had procured from a shady doctor on his payroll. The medical evidence is absolutely conclusive. Elijah continued projecting his voice to fill the room. Major Jocelyn exhibits extreme paranoia, isolationist behavior, and an inability to make sound financial judgments. She currently lives on a meager military salary and leaves 500 acres of prime real estate completely unmanaged. Letting her keep control of this asset is financial negligence. We respectfully request that her father, Harrison, be named her legal guardian and the property rights be immediately transferred to a family trust managed by myself and my wife, Courtney. We are simply trying to protect Jocelyn from her own failing mind. The sheer audacity of their lies was breathtaking. They were literally trying to steal my property in broad daylight and paint themselves as my saviors. Harrison let out a loud theatrical sigh and placed his face in his hands. Vivian patted his back, glaring at me with eyes full of pure venom. They thought they had won. They thought I was just a naive soldier who did not understand complex legal maneuvers. They assumed I had no money to fight them and no evidence to counter Elijah's slick presentation. The judge slowly turned the pages of Elijah's fabricated medical file. He looked down at me, his expression full of legal caution and misplaced pity. Major, the judge asked, his voice echoing in the tense silence of the room. Your family has presented some very serious allegations regarding your mental competency and your financial decision-making. You do not have legal counsel present with you at this defense table today. Do you have anything to say before I make a ruling on this petition for conservatorship? I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my jacket, feeling the weight of the classified documents sitting inside my leather briefcase. I looked at Elijah, who was already smiling like he had won the lottery. I looked at Courtney, who was practically vibrating with excitement over her imaginary luxury resort. Then I looked at my parents, the people who would gladly declare their own daughter insane just to pay off their bankrupt business debts. They thought they were burying a vulnerable soldier today. They had no idea they were trying to dig a grave for a billionaire. The judge raised his wooden gavel. His hand hovered in the air, ready to strike the sounding block and formally strip away my autonomy. Courtney leaned closer to Elijah, pressing her shoulder against his custom suit. I could hear her sharp intake of breath, a greedy gasp of anticipation. Vivian reached over and squeezed Harrison by the wrist. They were already spending the money in their heads. They were already bulldozing my grandfather's land to build their fake wellness resort. Your Honor, I request permission to approach the bench, I said. My voice cut through the heavy silence of the courtroom like a blade. It was not the shaky plea of a broken woman. It was the absolute command of a military officer. Elijah immediately jumped to his feet. He buttoned his suit jacket with a rapid, arrogant motion. Objection, Your Honor, he practically shouted. The respondent is unrepresented and highly unstable. Allowing her to present unverified testimony at the last minute is highly irregular and frankly dangerous to the proceedings. The judge frowned and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. Major, the evidence presented by your brother-in-law is substantial. Unless you have legal representation or certified documents to submit, I am ready to make my ruling. I have documents, Your Honor, I replied smoothly, and they are significantly more certified than the fraudulent paperwork my brother-in-law just handed you. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble. I picked up my leather briefcase and walked the short distance to the bench. The heavy thud of my combat boots echoed on the hardwood floor. Every eye in the room tracked my movement. I snapped the locks on the briefcase open. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy folder bound with a tamper evidence seal. Across the front, the words "Classified Department of Defense" were printed in bold red ink. I broke the seal right in front of the judge and placed the stack of documents directly on his desk. "What is this?" the judge asked. His authoritative tone faltered the moment he saw the official government seals. "That is my actual medical and psychological profile." "Your Honor," I said clearly, ensuring that every word reached the defense table where my family sat. Elijah submitted a mental health evaluation signed by a private clinic doctor who had his license suspended twice for writing fraudulent prescriptions. My evaluation, however, was conducted 72 hours ago at the Pentagon. The judge picked up the first packet of papers. His eyes widened as he scanned the letterhead. "As a cyber intelligence officer handling matters of national security, I am subjected to the most rigorous psychological evaluations on the planet," I continued. My voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "I hold a top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance. If I had even a fraction of the post-traumatic stress disorder or paranoia my family claims I possess, my clearance would be immediately revoked. Instead, you will see on page 3 that the Chief of Military Psychiatry has rated my mental acuity and psychological stability in the top 1% of active duty personnel. I am entirely sound of mind, Your Honor. In fact, I am operating at a cognitive level that my brother-in-law could not achieve on his best day." Elijah's face turned a dangerous shade of gray. His confident swagger vanished instantly. He scrambled to grab his own fake documents. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he stammered. His voice cracked, losing its smooth legal cadence. "We have no way to verify those military documents. She could have forged them." The judge glared at Elijah. "Counsel, these documents carry the official watermarks and digital verification signatures of the United States Department of Defense. They are signed by a 4-star general. Are you seriously suggesting the respondent forged a federal intelligence dossier just to bring it to family court today?" Elijah opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Courtney sank lower into her chair, her designer dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Vivian dropped her lace handkerchief. The performance of the grieving mother halted entirely. Harrison shifted his weight violently, causing the wooden bench to creak under him. I watched the judge flip to the appendix of the medical dossier. It detailed my recent command assessments. It highlighted my capacity to make high-stakes decisions under extreme pressure. The narrative Elijah had spun about a fragile, broken veteran needing a guardian collapsed entirely. Elijah had bet everything on the assumption that I would be too intimidated by his legal jargon to defend myself. He relied on the stereotype that soldiers were rigid and easily outmaneuvered in a civilian courtroom. He failed to realize that cyber intelligence officers do not just fight on battlefields. We analyze threat matrices. We identify vulnerabilities. We annihilate our targets using pure data. Elijah was nothing but a low-level threat matrix, and I had already mapped his complete destruction. I was not finished. I reached into the folder and pulled out the second stack of papers. I placed them deliberately on top of the medical files. "Furthermore, Your Honor," I said, "my family is claiming that I am financially negligent because I have left the 500 acres of land untouched. They claim it is a barren wasteland dragging down the family portfolio. That is another calculated lie designed to steal my inheritance." I tapped the heavy parchment document on the top of the pile. "This is the exclusive certificate of ownership and the unencumbered deed to the property I stated. You will note that the property taxes are paid in full for the next 10 years. There are 0 liens, 0 outstanding debts, and absolutely 0 claims allowed from anyone sharing my last name. My grandfather left that land to me specifically because he knew my father would bankrupt it within a year. And he was right. Harrison is currently dodging creditors while trying to use my asset to bail out his failing real estate business." "Objection!" Harrison roared from the back of the room. He shot up from his seat. His face was flushed crimson with rage. The veins in his neck bulged as the facade of the wealthy patriarch crumbled. "She is lying. We are trying to save this family." "Sit down, sir, or I will have the bailiff remove you," the judge barked, pointing his gavel at my father. Harrison froze. He looked at the armed bailiff stepping toward him, and slowly sank back into his seat, totally humiliated in a public forum. The judge turned his attention back to the deed. He adjusted his glasses again, reading the fine print of the ownership certificate. I watched his expression shift from legal skepticism to absolute shock. His hands actually trembled slightly as he traced the raised notary seal on the bottom of the page. He looked up at me as if seeing me for the very first time. The uniform was no longer just a piece of fabric, it was a shield they could not pierce. Elijah was sweating profusely now. He pulled at the collar of his expensive shirt. The crisp, professional image he had carefully curated was melting away. He knew what happened to lawyers who submitted perjured medical evaluations to a judge. He was looking at severe disciplinary action from the State Bar Association. But he still had no idea just how massive his miscalculation truly was. He still thought I was just a stubborn soldier clinging to a worthless plot of dirt. I stood tall, waiting for the judge to process the undeniable proof in front of him. I had completely dismantled their psychological attack. I had proven my ownership. I had exposed their greed. But I had not yet revealed the true payload. I had not yet told them what that land was actually worth. I watched Elijah whisper frantically to Courtney. I watched Vivian glare at me with unfiltered hatred. They were cornered, but they were still arrogant enough to think they had a way out. They were dead wrong. The judge flipped to the final page of the folder I had provided. He adjusted his glasses once more, leaning forward so sharply that his black robe slipped off his shoulder. He stared at the bold, undeniable figures printed on the unclassified summary sheet. Counsel, the judge said, his voice dropping an entire octave as he directed his gaze at my brother-in-law. In your petition, you submitted a property appraisal for the 500 acres in question. You assessed the total market value at exactly $200,000. You claimed it was entirely undeveloped, landlocked, and commercially useless. You used that specific valuation to argue that Major Jocelyn was suffering from financial delusions for refusing to sell it to a commercial developer. Elijah swallowed hard. He grabbed the edges of the defense podium. His knuckles turned a sharp ashen color against his dark skin. Yes, Your Honor. Elijah stammered frantically, trying to reconstruct his shattered credibility. The land is completely uncultivated. It is essentially a giant patch of useless dirt and weeds. My firm conducted a standard comparative market analysis. That valuation is entirely accurate for rural zoning. I did not even wait for the judge to reprimand him. I turned to face my family, directly locking eyes with my father. Harrison was still breathing heavily from his earlier outburst, his chest heaving under his expensive cashmere sweater. It is uncultivated because it is heavily restricted federal airspace, I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. 30 days ago, the United States Department of Defense officially selected those exact 500 acres to serve as the primary geographical hub for the new National Cybersecurity Data Center. We are building the most advanced, heavily fortified subterranean server facility on the eastern seaboard. I secured the exclusive contracting rights before the public announcement was even drafted. The federal government has already finalized the zoning permits and the infrastructure budget. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing them to hang on to my every word. I looked right at Courtney, who was gripping her designer handbag so tightly, her manicured acrylic nails looked ready to snap off. That land is not worth $200,000, I continued, enunciating every single syllable. The initial acquisition and development phase alone has appraised that specific parcel at exactly $45 million. And I own every single inch of it outright. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Harrison let out a sharp, strangled noise that sounded like a man physically choking on his own immense greed. He grabbed his chest, his eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at me as if I had suddenly turned into solid gold. Vivian let out a loud gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. All her carefully practiced country club elegance vanished instantly. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. Courtney actually knocked her chair backward, her jaw unhinged in pure, unfiltered jealousy. $45 million. That number echoed around the room, completely destroying their pathetic little narrative. They had spent my entire life calling me an ugly, unlovable disappointment who chose a starvation salary over their glamorous lifestyle. They had plotted to steal a supposedly worthless piece of dirt just to cover Harrison's impending bankruptcy. Now they realized they had just attempted to defraud the sole owner of a massive government defense contract. The judge slammed his gavel down against the sounding block with tremendous force. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, demanding absolute order. He glared at the defense table with a look of pure, unadulterated judicial rage. Counsel, the judge barked, his eyes fixed on Elijah with lethal intensity. You have brought a fraudulent medical evaluation into my courtroom. You have severely misrepresented the financial assets of a highly decorated active-duty military officer. You have attempted to use this legal venue to execute what appears to be a calculated malicious theft of a multi-million-dollar federal site. You are incredibly lucky that I am not ordering the bailiff to place you in handcuffs for perjury right this second. However, I will be forwarding the full transcript of this hearing directly to the State Bar Association for immediate disciplinary review. Elijah shrank back, his custom suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. He looked completely defeated, his legal career flashing before his eyes. This petition for conservatorship is dismissed with extreme prejudice, the judge announced loudly, striking the gavel one final time. Case closed. Major Jocelyn, you are free to go. Thank you for your service to this country. I nodded respectfully to the judge. I gathered my classified folders, slid them back into my leather briefcase, and snapped the lock shut. A surge of incredible satisfaction washed over me. I had faced down my toxic family and utterly annihilated their scheme without breaking a single sweat. I turned my back on them, ready to walk out of those heavy oak doors and leave them to drown in their own financial ruin. I took one solid step toward the aisle. Then I heard it. A low, arrogant chuckle. I stopped in my tracks. The sound was coming from Elijah. It was not the nervous laugh of a defeated man. It was the dark, calculating sound of a predator who still had one final trap hidden in the brush. I turned around slowly. Elijah had stepped away from the podium. He was no longer shrinking. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single folded sheet of thick legal paper. He smoothed it out with infuriating slowness, a wicked, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. Harrison and Vivian watched him, their eyes darting back and forth in sudden, desperate hope. Courtney mirrored her husband's malicious smile, crossing her arms over her chest. You put on a beautiful performance, Major Elijah said, his voice dripping with condescension. He held the paper up, waving it slightly in the air. $45 million. A Department of Defense contract. That is truly an incredible achievement for the family portfolio. It is just a shame you will not be the one making the executive decisions regarding that massive payout. I narrowed my eyes. My military training keeping my heart rate perfectly steady. What are you talking about? Elijah stepped forward and slapped the document onto the defense table. It does not matter that the judge dismissed the conservatorship, he declared, his eyes flashing with raw, unchecked greed. I do not need a court order to take control of your assets, Jocelyn, because you already gave me the keys to the castle. He tapped his index finger against the bottom of the page. This is a legally binding, fully notarized general power of attorney, Elijah announced loudly. You signed it 5 years ago, when you deployed overseas, giving me total unrestricted authority to act as your legal and financial representative in all domestic matters. You never revoked it. The conservatorship was just a formality to keep things quiet. But since you want to play hardball, I am officially exercising this power of attorney right now. I have the legal right to liquidate, transfer, or develop that $45 million property however I see fit. And my first official act will be transferring the deed to your father's holding company. The smirk on his face was absolute poison. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought he had just legally stolen my empire. He had no idea I had been waiting for him to play that exact card. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind me. I did not even make it to the security checkpoint before I heard the rapid echo of expensive leather shoes rushing across the marble floor. It was Harrison. My father had completely abandoned his furious, red-faced persona from just moments ago. He threw his hands up in a placating gesture, blocking my path to the exit. He forced a wide, uncomfortable smile onto his face, acting as if the despicable legal ambush I had just survived was nothing more than a minor scheduling error. "Jocelyn, please wait," Harrison said, his voice dripping with fake paternal warmth. "Let us not blow this out of proportion. Elijah is a lawyer and lawyers get overzealous. He was just throwing around legal jargon to protect the family assets. It was a massive misunderstanding. We were genuinely worried about your health, but clearly you are doing wonderfully. You have secured a federal contract. That is incredible news. We should be celebrating this massive achievement as a family." I stared at him, letting the absolute silence highlight his pathetic desperation. 10 minutes ago, he was screaming that I was a liar. Now he was looking at me like I was a walking ATM machine. He knew that if I walked out of that building and marched into a federal court to challenge that 5-year-old power of attorney, he would lose the $45 million forever. He needed to keep me close. He needed to trap me in a controlled environment where they could break me down psychologically. "Thanksgiving is tomorrow." Harrison continued, reaching out to pat my shoulder before I smoothly stepped out of his reach. "Your mother has been cooking for days. The whole extended family will be there. Come home for dinner. We can sit down like rational adults and figure out the best way to handle this real estate development together. No lawyers, no judges, just family working as a team." I knew exactly what he was doing. It was the classic bait and switch. But a predator does not run from a trap when she already knows how to dismantle the entire cage. I gave him a single curt nod and walked away without uttering a single word. I let him believe his desperate manipulation had actually worked. The next evening, I pulled my car into the winding driveway of my parents' massive estate in McLean. The property was a monument to Harrison's enormous ego. The perfectly manicured lawns and the towering brick columns were designed to scream generational wealth. But I knew the truth. I knew the mortgage was severely past due, and the bank was practically breathing down his neck. I stepped inside the grand foyer wearing a sharp, tailored civilian suit rather than my military uniform. The house was packed with aunts, uncles, and cousins who had all been fed the exact same toxic narrative about my life. The moment I entered the dining room, the lively chatter immediately died down. Eyes darted toward me, filled with a sickening mixture of pity and condescension. They had all been told I was a broken soldier struggling to survive. Vivian sat at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, holding a crystal glass of expensive wine. She wore a designer dress that cost more than my first car. She immediately launched her psychological assault the second I sat down, ensuring she had a captivated audience. "Jocelyn, darling, it is so brave of you to join us," Vivian announced, her voice carrying across the silent room. "We have all been so terribly worried about you. The military is such a harsh environment for a woman. It takes such a toll on the mind. We just want you to feel safe and protected here at home." I placed my linen napkin on my lap, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I did not take the bait. I simply looked at her, waiting for the inevitable pivot. Vivian took a slow sip of her wine, exchanging a knowing glance with Courtney. Courtney sat next to Elijah, twirling a diamond bracelet around her wrist. "We heard about the government contract," Vivian continued, leaning forward with a predatory gleam in her eye. "It is certainly a lucky break, but dealing with high-level federal development is incredibly dangerous. You have spent your entire adult life taking orders in a bunker, Jocelyn. You do not understand high finance. You do not understand commercial zoning or corporate taxation. The business world will eat you alive and strip you of every penny." Several relatives murmured in agreement, nodding their heads like programmed puppets. Harrison carved the turkey at the other end of the table, projecting the image of a wise protector. "Your mother is right," Jocelyn, Harrison added, passing a silver platter to Elijah. "You are a soldier. We respect that. But managing a $45 million asset requires a specialized skill set. It requires a killer instinct in the boardroom. If you try to manage this alone, you will embarrass the family name and lose the contract entirely. Elijah smiled smoothly, cutting into his food with casual arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, playing the role of the benevolent savior. He was fully relying on that old power of attorney he had flashed in the courtroom, thinking it gave him absolute leverage. "I deal with corporate acquisitions every single day," Elijah said, his deep voice designed to sound incredibly reassuring. "I have the contacts on Wall Street. I know how to structure the tax shelters. You should be focusing on your mental recovery, Jocelyn. Let me handle the heavy lifting. I will manage the property development through my firm. I can ensure the family company gets the contracting rights, and you will get a nice, safe monthly stipend to live comfortably. We keep the money in the family, and we keep you protected from the stress of the corporate world." Courtney chimed in immediately, her high-pitched voice grating against my ears. "It is the only logical solution, Jocelyn. Elijah is a professional. You are just not equipped for this level of wealth. If you do not let him take the reins, people will talk. They will say the family let a traumatized veteran ruin a generational opportunity. You have to do this for the family. You have to sign the development rights over to Elijah tonight so we can secure the future." I sat perfectly still, surrounded by their suffocating toxicity. They were executing a masterclass in gaslighting. They were trying to convince me that I was too incompetent, too damaged, and too naive to manage my own empire. They were demanding I hand over a massive federal asset to a man who was actively trying to defraud me just 24 hours ago. I looked at Vivian, who was smirking behind her wine glass. I looked at Harrison, who was waiting for me to surrender. I looked at Courtney and Elijah, who were already planning how to spend my millions. They thought they had backed me into a psychological corner. They thought the pressure of the extended family would force me to break. They had absolutely no idea that I was not just a soldier sitting at their dinner table. I was the silent executioner of their entire financial existence, and I was about to let them dig their graves exactly 1 foot deeper. Elijah did not waste another second. He reached down into the expensive leather briefcase resting beside his chair and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. The papers landed on the mahogany dining table with a heavy thud right next to the crystal gravy boat and the perfectly roasted turkey. He slid the packet across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of my untouched dinner plate. I glanced down at the bold black lettering printed across the top page. It was an irrevocable transfer of development rights and asset management agreement. Courtney leaned over and placed a gold-plated designer pen right on top of the signature line. Her eyes were wide and glittering with manufactured innocence. "Just sign it, Jocelyn," she said, her voice overly sweet and dripping with fake sisterly affection. "Elijah stayed up all night drafting this contract specifically to protect you. It puts the land into a joint family holding company. You will not have to worry about contractors or federal auditors or any of those scary government bureaucrats. We will take all that heavy burden right off your shoulders. You can just go back to your military base and relax knowing your big sister is handling the business." I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the contract designed to completely strip away my $45 million asset. Then I looked Courtney dead in the eyes. I did not reach for the pen. I picked up my crystal water goblet and took a slow, deliberate sip, maintaining absolute silence to let their anxiety build. "I am not signing anything," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a razor-sharp edge that instantly dropped the temperature in the room. Harrison slammed his fist down on the table, making the expensive silverware rattle against the fine china. "You will sign that contract, Jocelyn?" He barked, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. "You are being completely unreasonable and entirely selfish. We are offering you a safety net. This family is currently facing temporary liquidity issues because of the shifting real estate market. That land is the key to our survival. You owe it to this family to contribute your share." Vivian chimed in immediately, her tone shifting from fake concern to absolute venom. You have always been so ungrateful, she hissed, gripping her wineglass so tightly her knuckles turned white. We gave you everything. We clothed you and fed you and gave you a prestigious name. And now when your father needs a minor asset transfer to secure a commercial loan, you sit there, acting like an arrogant child. You are a soldier making a mediocre government salary. You have absolutely no idea how to manage wealth or handle high-level corporate investments. I slowly set my water goblet back down on the table. I let my gaze sweep across the faces of my extended family members, my aunts, uncles, and cousins who were watching this spectacle with wide, shocked eyes. It was time to shatter the flawless illusion Vivian and Harrison had spent decades building. Manage wealth. I repeated, letting the words hang heavily in the silent dining room. That is a fascinating choice of words, Mother. Because the last time I checked, the only people in this room who do not know how to manage wealth are the ones sitting at the head of this table. Courtney bristled, her fake supportive smile vanishing completely. What is that supposed to mean? She snapped, her posture stiffening defensively. I turned my full attention to my younger sister. I watched the nervous pulse beating rapidly in her neck. It means, Courtney, that I have a very clear memory of how this family handles finances, I stated, my voice cutting through the heavy tension like a surgical scalpel. Shall we talk about financial management today? Let us talk about what happened exactly 5 years ago, right before I deployed overseas. Let us talk about my college savings and my emergency deployment fund. Vivian's face went completely white. Harrison opened his mouth to shout, but I raised my hand with such commanding military authority that he actually froze in his seat. I had $80,000 saved in a joint family trust account. I continued, making sure every single relative at the table could hear me perfectly clearly. It was money I earned through academic scholarships and my early military stipends. I left it there because I trusted my parents. But when I came back from my first tour, that account was completely drained. Every single penny was gone. Courtney looked like she wanted to sink directly into the hardwood floor. Elijah stared at his wife, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his arrogant features. He clearly did not know this dark part of the family history. Do you want to tell your husband where my $80,000 went, Courtney? I challenged, leaning forward slightly. Or should I tell him? Should I tell him how our parents illegally withdrew my entire life savings just to bail you out of massive credit card debt? That is a lie. Courtney shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical octave. You are making things up because you are jealous of my success. I am not making up anything, I fired back, refusing to let her play the victim. You maxed out 6 different credit cards, playing the role of a wealthy self-made interior designer. You bought limited edition designer bags, red-soled luxury shoes, and first-class tickets to Paris just to post photos on social media and pretend you were a successful business owner. You were drowning in debt and facing multiple aggressive collection agencies. And instead of making you face the harsh consequences of your pathetic shopping addiction, our parents stole my money to pay off your creditors to protect the precious family image at the country club. The dining room descended into a state of absolute shock. My aunt, sitting 2 seats away, actually gasped out loud, covering her mouth in horror. The flawless, wealthy facade that Vivian had carefully curated for decades was crumbling into dust right in front of her peers. Harrison stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. That was a private family matter, he roared, pointing a trembling finger at me. You had no right to bring that up in front of everyone. We intended to pay you back. We were just reallocating funds to protect your sister from personal bankruptcy. Reallocating funds. I repeated, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips. That is the legal term for theft now. You stole my foundation to fund her delusions of grandeur. You left me with absolutely nothing while she paraded around in stolen luxury. And now you expect me to hand over a $45 million federal defense contract so you can cover up yet another one of your massive financial failures. I stood up slowly, mirroring my father's aggressive posture, but maintaining absolute icy composure. I looked down at the irrevocable transfer agreement sitting next to my plate. I picked up the document and held it in the air for everyone to see. Elijah was completely speechless. He looked from the document in my hand to his wife, who was now sobbing crocodile tears into her linen napkin. The great wealth management lawyer had just realized he married a massive financial liability, and his entire master plan was falling apart. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I tore the thick legal document squarely in half. The sound of tearing paper ripped loudly through the silent room. I tossed the shredded pieces directly onto Courtney's untouched dinner plate. "You want to play real estate developer, Courtney?" I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You can start by trying to buy your own property instead of trying to steal mine." I turned my back on the table and began walking toward the grand foyer. I had completely destroyed their psychological ambush. But just as my hand touched the heavy brass handle of the front door, Elijah's cell phone began to ring incessantly from inside his suit jacket. It was not a standard ringtone. It was the emergency bypass alert from his law firm. He answered it, his arrogant demeanor still deeply fractured. I paused by the door, listening as his aggressive tone instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic. The federal agents had just arrived at his office building, and the trap I set was finally springing shut. Elijah slammed his hand onto the table, interrupting the heavy silence that had fallen over the dining room. He was not about to let his golden goose walk away. The revelation about Courtney stealing my college savings had temporarily stunned him, but his greed quickly overpowered his surprise. He buttoned his suit jacket and puffed out his chest, reverting to the arrogant corporate lawyer persona he used to bully opponents in boardrooms. "You think a family dispute over old savings accounts changes the legal reality of this situation, Jocelyn?" he sneered. His voice was loud and dripping with absolute condescension. "You are severely underestimating who you are dealing with. I am a senior managing partner at one of the most ruthless wealth management firms on the East Coast. You are just a soldier who knows how to type code. That power of attorney you signed 5 years ago is still perfectly valid in the state of Virginia. If you walk out that door without signing a peaceful development agreement, I will immediately file an emergency injunction to freeze all of your financial assets." He stepped around the table, closing the distance between us. He wanted to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "I will tie that $45 million property up in civil litigation for the next 2 decades," Elijah threatened, his dark eyes flashing with malicious intent. "I will file motion after motion until the Department of Defense gets tired of the negative publicity and revokes your federal contract. I will bleed your military salary dry with legal fees until you are begging me to take that land off your hands. You do not have the capital or the legal comprehension to fight a protracted war of attrition against my firm. You belong in a trench, not a boardroom. Sign the secondary management agreement now, or I will personally ensure you lose every single penny of that government payout." Harrison and Vivian watched with bated breath, hoping Elijah's aggressive legal threats would force me into submission. Courtney wiped her eyes and managed a wicked little smile, confident that her husband was regaining control of my fortune. I stood perfectly still. I let his pathetic threats wash over me like rain on concrete. He really thought he held all the power. He truly believed his law degree made him invincible. I reached out and picked up the large crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux wine sitting next to my plate. The dark red liquid caught the light from the chandelier above us. I swirled the wine slowly, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with my arrogant brother-in-law. "You have a fundamental misunderstanding of the battlefield, Elijah," I said, my voice dangerously soft and entirely devoid of fear. "You think you are threatening a helpless veteran with paperwork. You do not realize that I map threat networks for a living. I track international cyber syndicates. Your little wealth management firm is nothing but a fragile house of cards built on other people's money." Without breaking eye contact, I tilted my hand forward. I poured the entire glass of dark red wine directly onto the center of the table. The expensive vintage splashed violently across the remaining shreds of his legal documents, soaking the thick parchment in deep crimson. The wine pooled and spread rapidly, staining Vivian's imported silk tablecloth and splashing directly onto the front of Elijah's custom-tailored trousers and leather shoes. Courtney let out a sharp shriek of horror as the red liquid ruined the flawless table setting. Elijah jumped back, swearing loudly, as the wine stained his expensive clothing. "You are going to regret that, you psychotic failure," he shouted frantically, brushing at his ruined trousers. "I will destroy your entire life. You are welcome to try." I replied smoothly, setting the empty crystal glass down on the ruined table with a solid click. "But you are going to be a little too busy defending your own freedom to worry about my real estate." I turned my back on the absolute chaos of the dining room. I walked toward the grand foyer, my posture perfectly straight, my strides measured and confident. I did not look back at my parents. I did not look back at my sister. I reached out and gripped the heavy brass handle of the front door, pulling it open to the cool night air. Right at that exact second, a sharp, aggressive ringing sliced through the shouting in the dining room. It was Elijah's cell phone. The customized emergency bypass ringtone reserved exclusively for his law firm's managing partners echoed loudly off the vaulted ceilings. The sheer urgency of the sound made everyone in the room freeze. Elijah snatched the phone from his inner pocket, his face still twisted in rage from the wine spill. He answered the call, barking his name into the receiver with extreme irritation. I stood in the open doorway, the cool breeze rushing past me as I listened to his side of the conversation. I watched his arrogant expression evaporate in a matter of seconds. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His jaw dropped open and the phone nearly slipped from his trembling fingers. "What do you mean they are freezing the trust accounts?" Elijah stammered, his voice cracking in pure terror. "What do you mean the building is surrounded? That is impossible. We use encrypted offshore routing. Who authorized a raid?" He listened to the frantic voice of his law partner on the other end of the line. His knees physically buckled and he had to grab the edge of the ruined dining table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had just breached the lobby of his prestigious law firm. Armed federal agents were currently seizing every computer server, every paper file, and every digital ledger in the building. They were executing a massive no-knock search warrant for federal money laundering, wire fraud, and the illegal concealment of offshore assets. The multi-million-dollar financial empire Elijah used to bully and intimidate his victims was being dismantled brick by brick. Harrison and Vivian stared at their son-in-law in absolute shock. Courtney began to hyperventilate, realizing her luxurious lifestyle was currently burning to the ground. Elijah looked up from his phone, his eyes wild with panic. He stared across the room at me, standing calmly in the doorway. He finally realized the magnitude of his fatal error. They said an anonymous whistleblower triggered the federal audit. Elijah whispered, his voice hollow and shaking with dread. "They said a high-level cybersecurity system bypassed our firewalls and sent our encrypted ledgers directly to the Department of Justice." I gave him one final cold, uncompromising smile. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the heavy front door shut behind me, leaving them trapped inside their own collapsing world. The trap I had meticulously built, piece by digital piece, had just snapped shut and there was absolutely no escape. Elijah paced the length of his massive living room like a caged animal. The news of the federal raid on his law firm had completely broken his arrogant facade. His custom Italian suit jacket lay discarded on the floor. His silk tie was violently loosened around his neck. The FBI had seized every single hard drive, every client ledger, and every encrypted offshore account file in his building. He knew he was looking at decades in federal prison for money laundering and wire fraud. But men like Elijah do not accept defeat gracefully. They drag everyone else down with them. He needed a scapegoat. He needed a massive public distraction to shift the narrative away from his own financial crimes. He looked at Courtney, who was currently sobbing on their velvet sofa, mourning the sudden loss of her limitless credit cards. Elijah grabbed her by the shoulders and told her it was time to go on the offensive. They were going to weaponize the internet. Within 48 hours, the digital smear campaign was launched with terrifying efficiency. Courtney positioned her smartphone on a tripod in her meticulously decorated kitchen. She made sure the lighting was perfectly dim. She wore no makeup, allowing the dark circles under her eyes to show. She dressed in an oversized beige sweater to make herself look incredibly small and vulnerable. Then she hit the record button and delivered the performance of a lifetime to her 200,000 followers. She did not mention the $45 million defense contract. She did not mention the money they stole from my college fund. Instead, she looked directly into the camera lens, with tears streaming down her face, and painted a picture of absolute terror. "My older sister has completely lost her mind," Courtney cried, wiping a carefully choreographed tear from her cheek. "She serves as a high-ranking military intelligence officer, and she is using her government clearance to illegally target our family. We tried to get her psychiatric help for her deployment trauma. In retaliation, she abused her federal power to fabricate criminal charges against my husband's law firm. She sent armed agents to raid his office just to steal our family estate. I am terrified for my life. I am terrified of what she will use the military to do next. Please help us share this video. We need protection from her absolute abuse of power." The video went viral in a matter of hours. The algorithm rewarded her fake tears with millions of views. The internet thrives on outrage, and Courtney handed them a perfect villain. I was suddenly branded as the rogue military officer abusing government resources to crush innocent civilians. The hashtag justice for Courtney began trending across every major social media platform. My inbox was flooded with death threats from anonymous accounts. Digital mobs demanded that I be court-martialed, stripped of my rank, and thrown in federal prison. Elijah used his legal connections to leak carefully edited fragments of the conservatorship petition to local news outlets, pushing the narrative that I was a deeply unstable veteran who had violently turned against a loving family. While Courtney and Elijah burned my reputation to the ground online, my mother Vivian took the campaign of destruction to the physical world. She marched directly into the most exclusive country club in McLean, Virginia, armed with a lace handkerchief and a rehearsed script of maternal grief. She sat on the sunlit terrace surrounded by the wealthy wives of senators, corporate executives, and hedge fund managers. Vivian ordered a dry martini and began to systematically assassinate my character among the Virginia elite. "It breaks my heart to speak about my own flesh and blood," Vivian said, pressing the handkerchief to her chest. "We gave Jocelyn everything. We paid for the best tutors. We provided a loving home. But she always resented this family. She always hated our success. When Harrison asked her to help with a minor real estate development, she snapped. She used her cyber intelligence connections to plant false financial records on poor Elijah's servers. She orchestrated that entire federal raid just out of pure spite. She is an ungrateful, cold-blooded monster. We are currently living in a nightmare because we tried to love a daughter who has no soul." The gossip spread through the affluent community like wildfire. In their wealthy circles, image was everything, and Vivian had successfully painted me as a toxic liability. The judgment was absolute. When I walked into my regular coffee shop near the military base the following morning, I could feel the heavy stares. People whispered behind their hands. The barista, who usually greeted me with a smile, now handed me my coffee with nervous, avoiding eyes. They had all seen the viral video. They had all heard the country club rumors. I was the crazy veteran. I was the ungrateful daughter trying to destroy a successful African-American lawyer and a crying interior designer. My command officers at the Pentagon called me into a secure briefing room to discuss the sudden media storm. The optics were terrible. Elijah was actively trying to force the military to suspend my security clearance pending a public investigation. He wanted to paralyze my career to prevent me from finalizing the $45 million real estate development. He thought if he turned the world against me, I would crumble under the immense public pressure and beg for a settlement. He thought public humiliation was my ultimate breaking point. But Elijah, Courtney, and Vivian made one critical, catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed I cared about the opinions of strangers on the internet. They assumed the judgmental whispers of wealthy housewives in a country club meant anything to a woman who neutralized global cyber threats for a living. I did not record a pathetic rebuttal video. I did not hire a public relations firm to issue a dramatic statement defending my honor. I did not shed a single tear over the vicious lies they were actively spreading to anyone who would listen. Instead, I drove directly back to my highly secured penthouse apartment. I locked the heavy steel door behind me and poured myself a single glass of bourbon. I opened my encrypted laptop and brought up the live financial tracking feeds for Harrison's real estate development company. Let them scream on social media. Let them cry at the country club. I was not going to fight them in public. I was going to obliterate them in the only arena that actually mattered to their hollow souls. I cracked my knuckles over the keyboard, ready to execute the final devastating phase of my financial takeover. Harrison threw the most extravagant fundraising gala his severely over-leveraged credit accounts could possibly afford. He rented an enormous ballroom at the most prestigious hotel in downtown Washington. The room was draped in white silk and decorated with towering floral arrangements that cost more than a luxury vehicle. He hired a string quartet to play classical music in the corner and ordered cases of imported champagne to flow freely among the wealthy guests. The entire event was a desperate, carefully orchestrated illusion of financial stability. He invited every major real estate developer, every hedge fund manager, and every high-rolling private investor he knew. Harrison needed a massive injection of capital to save his sinking real estate empire from complete foreclosure, and he was using the viral internet drama as his primary fundraising weapon. Vivian floated through the crowd in a custom designer gown, playing the role of the tragically betrayed matriarch. She clutched a crystal flute of champagne and leaned in close to potential investors, spinning a narrative of absolute victimhood. She told them how her real estate company was temporarily struggling because they had spent millions trying to get psychiatric help for their deeply disturbed military daughter. Courtney and Elijah stood by the ice sculpture repeating the same vicious lies. Courtney wore a borrowed diamond necklace and wiped away fake tears whenever an investor looked in her direction. Elijah stood tall, trying to project confidence despite the fact that federal agents were currently dissecting his entire legal career. They were selling a story of family betrayal to open the wallets of sympathetic billionaires. Harrison stepped up to the gold-plated microphone positioned in the center of the ballroom. He tapped the microphone, demanding the attention of the ultra-rich crowd. He put on his best devastated father face and delivered a perfectly rehearsed speech. He publicly disowned me right there in front of 200 wealthy elites. He declared that I was a rogue operative, a toxic element that had been formally eradicated from the family tree. He promised the investors that his company was clean, stable, and ready for a massive financial expansion now that the family had cut ties with their ungrateful, unstable daughter. The crowd applauded. They wrote massive checks believing they were supporting a noble patriarchal businessman who had survived a terrible family tragedy. They were toasting to their imaginary victory while I was sitting in a pitch-black, heavily fortified server room miles away. I was not wearing a designer gown. I was not crying into a lace handkerchief. I was wearing tactical gear and sitting in front of 8 glowing computer monitors. My secure facility was completely soundproof and chilled to exactly 60 degrees to keep the massive data servers from overheating. The viral videos and the country club gossip meant absolutely nothing inside this room. Social media outrage is just noise, and I do not deal in noise. I deal exclusively in cold, hard, undeniable data. While Harrison was begging for donations, I was executing a hostile financial takeover of epic proportions. 10 years ago, I realized that a military salary would never provide the capital I needed to truly secure my independence. So I spent my nights coding. I built proprietary encryption algorithms and predictive threat matrices that the commercial sector desperately needed. I founded a private cybersecurity corporation, under a heavily shielded holding company. I named it Aegis Shield. I secured contracts with international banks, major tech conglomerates, and eventually the Department of Defense. Aegis Shield grew from a tiny startup into a multi-billion-dollar titan of digital security. And the best part was that absolutely no one in my toxic family knew I was the sole founder and chief executive officer. I watched the live financial feeds on my center monitor. Harrison's real estate company was publicly traded, but it was bleeding out rapidly. His stock prices were plummeting due to the catastrophic mismanagement he had hidden for years. He thought the checks he was collecting at his pathetic gala tonight would save him. He had no idea that I had already deployed a team of elite financial analysts on Wall Street. I gave them one simple overarching directive: buy everything. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, typing the final sequences of a massive routing protocol. I was doing nothing illegal. I was using the sheer, overwhelming financial weight of Aegis Shield to legally crush his company. I routed hundreds of millions of dollars through completely legitimate corporate acquisition channels. I bought up every single piece of toxic debt Harrison had accumulated. I bought his commercial mortgages. I acquired the promissory notes he had signed with desperate secondary lenders. I deployed an aggressive algorithm to buy every share of his company's stock the second it hit the open market. I watched the progress bars on my screens tick upward with lethal precision. Harrison needed a majority stake to maintain control of his own company. He was currently holding on to 49%, hoping the investors at his gala would help him secure the rest. He was exactly 2 hours too late. I typed the final string of authentication codes to authorize the ultimate transaction. I hit the enter key with a solid, satisfying strike. The screens flashed a brilliant, vibrant green, confirming the digital transfer. The banking protocols locked into place across the global financial grid. It was an absolute flawless execution. I leaned back in my tactical chair and watched the numbers solidify on the main display. Aegis Shield now officially owned 51% of my father's real estate empire. I did not just buy his debt. I bought his entire corporate existence. He was standing on a stage downtown, sipping expensive champagne and thanking his wealthy friends for saving his company. He had no idea the company no longer belonged to him. He was now just a minority shareholder in a corporation completely controlled by the daughter he had just publicly disowned. The trap was locked. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of my absolute triumph wash over me. The war was over, and they did not realize they lost. I leaned closer to the primary monitor, illuminating the dark server room with a cold blue glow. Owning 51% of my father's real estate empire was the tactical foundation, but it was not the finishing blow. Harrison was currently standing in a luxury hotel ballroom, shaking hands with elite investors and collecting massive checks. He believed that fresh influx of capital would dilute my newly acquired majority stake. He assumed he could use his wealthy country club connections to buy his way out of the hole he had dug for himself. He completely underestimated the sheer gravitational pull of Aegis Shield. I did not just have enough money to buy his company outright. I had the leverage to make sure no one else on Wall Street would ever give him another dime. I opened a highly secure encrypted communication channel, bridging a direct connection to my primary financial proxies in New York. These were the ruthless hedge fund managers and private equity directors who handled the public-facing investments for my cybersecurity corporation. They did not know my real name or my military rank. They only knew me as the anonymous chief executive officer of Aegis Shield, a corporate entity that generated billions of dollars in annual revenue for their portfolios. I initiated a rapid sequence conference call with the 3 largest institutional investors currently backing Harrison's real estate firm. My voice was digitally altered through the secure connection, masking my identity completely. I projected the undeniable financial data directly onto their screens. I showed them the severely leveraged commercial mortgages, the plummeting property valuations, and the hidden toxic debt Courtney had racked up under the company expense accounts. Then I delivered the ultimate kill shot. I transmitted the sealed federal indictment currently being drafted against Elijah. I showed the Wall Street executives that Harrison's lead legal counsel and son-in-law was about to be federally prosecuted for massive wire fraud and offshore money laundering. I made the ultimatum incredibly simple. I told the investment directors that if they kept a single penny of their capital tied up in Harrison's collapsing real estate firm, Aegis Shield would immediately terminate all lucrative cybersecurity contracts with their respective financial institutions. The choice took them less than 60 seconds to make. They were not going to risk billions of dollars in guaranteed government defense tech revenue just to save a sinking Virginia real estate contractor. I watched my monitors as the massive institutional sell-off began. The withdrawal was swift, brutal, and entirely catastrophic for my family. The Wall Street partners executed an emergency divestment protocol. They dumped millions of shares of Harrison's company stock, simultaneously triggering a massive algorithmic panic across the trading floors. The institutional capital that had been artificially propping up his business evaporated into thin air. I watched the live financial tracking feeds as the stock price went into an absolute freefall. The automated trading bots registered the sudden massive exit of the anchor investors and immediately initiated a cascading sell-off. Within minutes, the entire market valuation of the company was slashed by 70%. All the credit lines Harrison relied on to keep his construction projects moving were automatically frozen by the banking algorithms. The financial hemorrhage was spectacular to witness. I sat back in my tactical chair, taking a slow sip of black coffee. I had systematically dismantled a multi-million-dollar real estate empire without ever leaving my secure bunker. I had used pure, unadulterated data to sever the financial arteries of the people who had treated me like a worthless disappointment my entire life. Miles away in the opulent ballroom of the downtown Washington hotel, the illusion of success was still in full swing. Harrison was holding a crystal flute of expensive imported champagne, laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent state senator. Vivian was standing by his side, adjusting her designer necklace and accepting compliments from wealthy socialites. They were completely intoxicated by their own fake prestige. Courtney was busy taking photos for her social media accounts, posing with other ultra-rich guests, while trying to ignore the nervous sweat breaking out on Elijah's forehead. Elijah had been checking his phone obsessively ever since the federal raid on his law office, waiting for the inevitable call from his defense attorneys. The string quartet was playing a lively symphony, filling the grand room with an air of absolute victory. Harrison raised his glass to the crowd, preparing to make another arrogant toast about the resilient strength of his business empire. He thought he had successfully banished his military daughter from the family narrative and secured his wealthy future. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor that had already been pulled wide open. Right in the middle of the crowded ballroom, Harrison's cell phone began to vibrate violently inside his tailored suit jacket. He initially ignored it, wanting to bask in the applause of his wealthy investors. But the phone immediately rang again, slicing through the classical music with an aggressive, urgent tone. He pulled the device from his pocket, annoyed by the interruption. He saw the caller identification, and his arrogant smile faltered slightly. It was his chief financial officer. Harrison stepped away from the crowd, holding a finger up to Vivian, signaling he would be back in a moment. He answered the call, his voice booming with unearned confidence. He expected a status update on the evening fundraising totals. Instead, he was met with the frantic, hyperventilating voice of his lead accountant. The words spilled through the receiver like a death sentence. The largest anchor investment fund had just pulled out every single dollar of their capital. The secondary hedge funds had followed suit, triggering a massive panic sell-off. The company credit lines were entirely frozen, and the corporate accounts were completely overdrawn. His business was officially facing total, unavoidable bankruptcy. Harrison physically staggered backward. His heavy frame collided with a linen-covered cocktail table, sending empty glasses crashing to the marble floor. Vivian rushed toward him, her perfectly manicured hands reaching out in alarm as all the color drained from his face. The entire ballroom grew deadly quiet as the guests watched the powerful patriarch begin to hyperventilate. Harrison gripped the phone to his ear, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. He demanded to know how this was possible and who had triggered the collapse. The chief financial officer delivered the final devastating blow. A mysterious, anonymous corporate entity had just aggressively purchased 51% of the company's stock on the open market, holding the absolute power of life and death over the entire real estate empire. The anonymous titan now held all the voting rights, and Harrison was completely powerless to stop them. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Harrison's trembling fingers and shattered into 100 jagged pieces on the floor, matching the exact state of his entire ruined life. The morning sun cast long, harsh shadows across the polished mahogany table inside the executive boardroom of my father's real estate corporation. Just 24 hours ago, this room had been a monument to his absolute power. Today, it was a customized execution chamber. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, but Harrison was sweating profusely. He sat at the head of the massive table, his usually immaculate silver hair completely disheveled. The expensive custom-tailored suit he wore looked entirely too large for his suddenly diminished frame. His hands shook visibly as he gripped a stack of worthless financial projections. The corporate empire he had spent decades building upon a foundation of arrogance and toxic debt was bleeding to death in real time, and he had absolutely no idea how to stop the hemorrhage. Vivian sat directly to his right, gripping a styrofoam cup of bitter office coffee, instead of her usual crystal flute of imported champagne. Her designer makeup was smudged beneath her bloodshot eyes, revealing the deep exhaustion of a woman who had spent the entire night watching her social status evaporate. Courtney occupied the seat next to her mother, openly weeping into a crumpled tissue. Her diamond bracelets clinked against the wooden table every time she let out a pathetic, dramatic sob. She was mourning the sudden, immediate cancellation of her limitless platinum credit cards. Elijah sat frozen at the far end of the family block. The arrogant African-American wealth management lawyer looked like a cornered animal. He kept his eyes glued to his silenced cell phone, waiting for the federal indictment to drop. His own law firm was currently wrapped in yellow crime scene tape, and he knew he was dragging the rest of his in-laws down with him. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. 6 minority shareholders entered the room, moving with cold, calculated precision. These were the few remaining investors who had not managed to dump their stock before my aggressive takeover algorithm froze the market. They were angry, wealthy men and women who demanded immediate answers for the catastrophic financial collapse. They took their seats across from my family, folding their hands and staring at Harrison with absolute undisguised contempt. There were no friendly country club greetings today. There were no polite inquiries about golf handicaps or upcoming charity galas. There was only the brutal, unforgiving reality of massive corporate failure. Harrison forced himself to stand up. His knees actually buckled slightly against the edge of the heavy mahogany table. He cleared his throat, attempting to project the booming authoritative voice he always used to intimidate his subordinates. It sounded weak and hollow. He looked at the angry faces of the minority shareholders and offered a pathetic, trembling smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "I want to thank you all for attending this emergency session on such incredibly short notice. I know the sudden market fluctuations yesterday afternoon were quite alarming. However, I want to personally assure every single person in this room that our core business model remains fundamentally strong. We are simply experiencing a temporary liquidity crisis caused by unforeseen economic headwinds and an unpredictable commercial real estate market." A senior board member, an older woman with steel gray hair and zero patience, slammed her hand flat against the table. "Do not insult our intelligence. Harrison!" She barked, her voice echoing sharply. "This is not a market fluctuation. This is a total financial slaughter. 3 major institutional funds pulled out simultaneously. Your credit lines are entirely frozen, and your debt-to-income ratio is toxic. We need to know exactly what caused this mass exodus of capital before we lose everything. Harrison wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. He completely ignored his own reckless borrowing and the fraudulent expense reports he had approved for Courtney. He desperately tried to spin a narrative of external victimization. The market overreacted to a temporary cash flow issue, Harrison pleaded, leaning heavily over the table. The banks got spooked by a minor internal audit. I am formally asking this board to authorize an immediate emergency bridge loan. If we can just secure a rapid capital injection of $20 million, we can stabilize the stock price. We can reassure the secondary lenders and get our construction projects back on track. I just need you to trust my leadership for one more quarter. We have survived tough economies before. We can survive this together. Vivian immediately chimed in, attempting to weaponize her fading socialite charm. Please, everyone, Vivian begged, placing her hand dramatically over her heart. Our family has dedicated our entire lives to this corporation. We have generated incredible wealth for all of you over the past decade. We are asking for loyalty. We just need a little faith to weather this unexpected storm. Another board member, a ruthless venture capitalist, let out a loud, bitter laugh. Loyalty does not pay the creditors, Vivian. He turned his furious gaze toward Elijah. And speaking of audits, perhaps your brilliant son-in-law can explain why the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided his law firm yesterday evening. Rumor on Wall Street is that his offshore accounts are directly tied to this very corporation. Elijah shrank back in his leather chair, completely paralyzed by the direct accusation. He opened his mouth to deploy his usual slick legal jargon, but his voice failed him entirely. Courtney let out another loud, obnoxious sob, burying her face in her hands. We do not have time for your family drama, the senior board member stated coldly. Harrison, your company was aggressively acquired yesterday by an anonymous corporate entity. A holding group operating under the name Aegis Shield just purchased 51% of our voting shares on the open market. They now hold the absolute power of life and death over this entire corporation. You are no longer in control, Harrison. Harrison collapsed back into his chair, his face completely ashen. I know, he whispered, his voice defeated and broken. I do not know who they are. I do not know what they want. But their legal representatives demanded this emergency board meeting. The new majority shareholder is waiting outside those doors right now to decide our ultimate fate. The entire room fell dead silent. The minority shareholders braced themselves for a brutal corporate restructuring. Harrison and Vivian stared at the heavy glass doors, terrified of the faceless billionaire who had just bought their entire existence. They were praying for a merciful corporate buyout. They were hoping a generous venture capitalist would walk through those doors and offer them a generous severance package. They had absolutely no idea that the executioner standing on the other side of the glass was the exact same daughter they had just publicly disowned and abandoned. The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom did not just open. They were pushed apart with a sudden forceful momentum that sent a shockwave of cold air sweeping across the polished mahogany table. Every single person in the room flinched, holding their breath as they braced for the arrival of the ruthless corporate titan who had just decimated their financial portfolios. Harrison gripped the edge of his leather chair so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. Vivian pressed her hand against her chest, attempting to project an image of welcoming grace. Courtney stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her tear-streaked face turning toward the entrance with desperate, pathetic hope. Elijah stared blankly at the doorway, terrified that federal agents had followed the mysterious billionaire inside. They were all expecting a ruthless Wall Street veteran. They were anticipating an older, gray-haired private equity director flanked by a terrifying army of corporate lawyers carrying briefcases full of liquidation documents. Instead, I walked through those heavy doors. I was not wearing my military uniform. I had traded my combat boots and tactical gear for a custom-tailored charcoal gray designer business suit that fit my frame with absolute lethal precision. The fabric was immaculate sharp and undeniably expensive, screaming quiet generational wealth and unapologetic corporate dominance. I wore a crisp white silk blouse and a pair of black stiletto heels that struck the hardwood floor with a sharp, rhythmic click. I did not carry a weapon, but my posture was a loaded gun. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, flawless bun, leaving my face completely exposed and entirely devoid of mercy. I looked absolutely nothing like the broken, traumatized veteran they had tried to medically commit just 24 hours ago in family court. I looked like a woman who owned the building. The collective reaction inside the boardroom was instantaneous and spectacular to witness. The minority shareholders furrowed their brows in absolute confusion, failing to recognize me. But the immediate family block reacted as if a live grenade had just been rolled across the conference table. Vivian let out a sharp, audible gasp, her eyes widening to the size of saucers. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth, stifling a shriek of pure disbelief. Courtney actually dropped her crumpled tissue onto the floor, her jaw unhinging as she stared at my designer suit. She immediately recognized the sheer immense cost of the fabric I was wearing, and it short-circuited her materialistic brain. Elijah physically recoiled in his chair, pressing his back against the leather upholstery, as if trying to merge with the wall behind him. The arrogant lawyer finally realized that the woman he had attempted to defraud was standing in front of him, radiating absolute unchecked power. Harrison, however, bypassed shock completely and went straight into a blinding, uncontrollable rage. The terrified, desperate executive who was just begging for a bridge loan vanished instantly. The arrogant, abusive patriarch returned in full force. Harrison shot up from his chair so violently that it slammed against the credenza behind him. The veins in his forehead throbbed with thick, hot blood. His face turned a dangerous, alarming shade of purple. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my chest, completely ignoring the presence of his furious shareholders. "What in the hell are you doing here?" Harrison roared, his voice tearing through the tense silence of the boardroom. "Who let you inside this building? This is a highly restricted emergency executive session. You have absolutely no right to step foot inside this facility, Jocelyn." I did not break my stride. I continued walking down the length of the massive mahogany table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. I kept my eyes locked directly on my father, letting him completely unravel in front of his peers. "Get out of this room right this second," Harrison bellowed, taking a threatening step forward. "You psychotic, ungrateful failure. You think you can just waltz into my corporate headquarters wearing a fancy suit and disrupt the most critical financial meeting of my entire life. We are waiting for the majority shareholder to arrive. We are trying to save this family from absolute destruction. You are a massive liability, and I will not let your petty, pathetic vendettas ruin this corporation." Vivian immediately joined the assault, sensing an opportunity to play the victimized mother in front of the board. "Jocelyn, please," Vivian cried out, her voice dripping with fake dramatic panic. "Have you lost your mind entirely? We know you are angry about the country club rumors, but this is a multi-million-dollar crisis. You are a soldier making a government salary. You do not understand high-level corporate finance. You are going to embarrass us in front of the new owners. Leave this building before you humiliate yourself any further." Courtney sneered, her jealousy piercing through her previous tears. "She is probably just here to beg for a handout," Courtney hissed, leaning across the table. "She saw the news about the bankruptcy and wants to make sure she gets a piece of the pie before the company goes under. Tell her to leave, Dad. She is just a distraction." Harrison did not hesitate. He slammed his hand down on the digital intercom console, resting in the center of the table. He pressed the red emergency button with frantic, aggressive force. Security Harrison barked into the speaker, his voice echoing loudly through the room. "I need a full security detail up in the executive boardroom immediately. I have a hostile trespasser trespassing on private corporate property. I want her physically escorted out of this building and thrown directly onto the street. If she resists, call the local police and have her arrested for trespassing." He released the button and glared at me, breathing heavily. His chest puffed out in a pathetic display of hollow authority. He turned to the confused minority shareholders, offering them a tight, nervous smile. "I sincerely apologize for this absurd interruption, ladies and gentlemen," Harrison said, trying to smooth his wrinkled suit jacket. "This is my estranged daughter. She suffers from severe mental instability due to her military deployments. She has a history of dramatic outbursts. The guards will remove her shortly, and then we can get back to negotiating with the new holding company. Please just ignore her delusions." I finally stopped walking. I stood exactly 3 feet away from the head of the table. I looked at my father with an expression of pure, icy detachment. I did not yell. I did not scramble to defend my mental state. I simply tilted my head and offered him a slow, lethal smile that made the remaining color completely drain from his face. The intercom on the table crackled to life. The static sound filled the quiet room, followed by the hesitant, nervous voice of the head security guard. "Mr. Harrison, sir." The guard stammered, his tone completely lacking the obedience my father expected. "We cannot send a detail up to remove that woman, sir. We were given strict standing orders this morning regarding her arrival." Harrison's eyes widened in shock. "What are you talking about?" he yelled at the speaker. "I am the chief executive officer of this corporation. I am giving you a direct order to remove her right now." "I am sorry, sir," the guard replied, his voice dropping lower. "But we work for the building management group, and the management group just received a direct mandate from the new majority stakeholders. We were explicitly told that under no circumstances is anyone allowed to interfere with that specific individual." Harrison stared at the intercom as if it had just grown fangs and bitten him. He looked up at me, his jaw going completely slack. The air in the room grew incredibly thin. The shareholders shifted in their seats, suddenly realizing that the power dynamic in the room was entirely upside down. I reached out and pressed the end call button on the intercom, cutting off the guard's connection. I picked up the printed financial agenda sitting in front of my father's empty chair and casually tossed it into the nearest trash can. "You are not giving orders to anyone today, Harrison," I said, my voice slicing through the room with absolute chilling authority. "You do not own this security team. You do not own this boardroom. And you certainly do not own me." I stepped closer to the head of the table, forcing him to physically back away from his own designated seat. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany, leaning forward to deliver the final devastating blow. "You can cancel the security detail," I continued, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. "Because the person you are currently trying to throw out onto the street is the exact same person who now owns the building." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy. It was the kind of deafening quiet that only occurs right before a catastrophic physical impact. Harrison stared at me with his mouth slightly ajar. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the sequence of words I had just spoken. His brain simply refused to accept the data. He looked wildly around the room, searching for someone to validate his reality. He turned his desperate gaze toward the senior minority shareholders sitting across the table, expecting them to call security themselves. "This is insanity," Harrison stammered, his voice vibrating with a mixture of terror and rage. "She is completely delusional. I apologize for this ridiculous spectacle. My daughter is clearly experiencing a severe psychological episode. She does not own anything. She is a low-ranking soldier swimming in debt. I demand that we proceed with the emergency bridge loan discussion immediately." Nobody at the minority shareholder block moved. Nobody rushed to comfort him. Instead, the lead representative of the Wall Street proxy group stood up. His name was Preston Caldwell, a ruthless senior investment director known for dismantling failing corporations with surgical precision. He wore a navy pinstripe suit and carried an aura of absolute financial authority. Preston did not look at Harrison. He did not offer my father a reassuring smile. He kept his eyes locked entirely on me. Preston Caldwell reached up and calmly buttoned his suit jacket. He stepped away from the dominant center chair he had occupied since the meeting began. He took a deliberate, respectful step backward. Then, in front of my furious father and my utterly confused family, The ruthless Wall Street director bowed his head in a gesture of profound professional deference. "Please take your seat," Madam Chairman Preston said, his voice echoing with crystal clear clarity. "We have been awaiting your arrival to commence the corporate restructuring protocols." The breath physically left Harrison's lungs in a loud, wheezing gasp. Vivian dropped her styrofoam cup of coffee, spilling the lukewarm brown liquid all over her designer skirt. She did not even notice the stain. Courtney let out a strange, high-pitched squeak, pressing her hands against her cheeks. Elijah gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly I could hear the leather stretching under his manicured fingernails. I stepped past my father without giving him a single glance. I walked to the center of the mahogany table and took the dominant executive chair. The leather was cool and firm against my back. I rested my hands on the polished wood commanding the room with the exact same posture I used in the Pentagon briefing rooms. Preston Caldwell remained standing. He turned to face the terrified executives and the remaining board members. "Members of the board," Preston announced, projecting his voice to ensure every single person heard the undeniable truth. "Allow me to formally introduce the anonymous majority stakeholder who executed yesterday's aggressive market acquisition. You have known her as Major Jocelyn. However, the global financial sector knows her by her corporate designation. She is the sole anonymous founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Shield." Harrison gripped his chest, his face turning a sickly shade of ash gray. "That is impossible!" he wheezed, his voice completely devoid of its former arrogance. "Aegis Shield is a massive defense contractor. They are a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate. She is just a military dropout. She does not have that kind of capital." Preston Caldwell looked at my father with an expression of pure, unfiltered pity. "Your daughter is one of the most brilliant cyber intelligence architects in the Western Hemisphere," Preston stated coldly. 10 years ago, she developed proprietary encryption algorithms that currently secure the digital infrastructure of Wall Street and the Department of Defense. Aegis Shield was recently valued at over $3 billion. And yesterday afternoon she utilized a fraction of her personal corporate capital to execute a flawless hostile takeover of your entire real estate portfolio. The numbers hung in the air like a guillotine blade dropping in slow motion. $3 billion. The family that had spent decades calling me a pathetic, unlovable failure was suddenly staring at a self-made billionaire. They had mocked my military service. They had ridiculed my career choices. They had actively conspired to steal a piece of land from me just to pay off their toxic debts. Now they realized they were sitting in a room entirely owned by the woman they had relentlessly abused. Preston was not finished. He opened his leather portfolio and pulled out a stack of legally binding acquisition documents. For the record, Preston continued reading directly from the financial ledger. "Aegis Shield has successfully acquired 51% of the voting shares for this corporation. Furthermore, Madam Chairman has authorized the aggressive purchase of all your outstanding commercial mortgages and secondary lender notes." She did not just buy the majority stock, Harrison. She bought your toxic debt. She is now your primary creditor. You do not owe the banks anymore. You owe her. Every single piece of drywall, every construction permit, and every remaining dollar in your corporate accounts belongs exclusively to her. Vivian began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved dramatically as her eyes darted wildly around the boardroom. She looked at my custom-tailored suit, the flawless silk blouse, the undeniable aura of a woman who commanded a global empire. The realization struck her with the force of a freight train. She had spent her entire morning complaining to her wealthy country club friends about her poor, broken military daughter. She had permanently ruined her own social standing by lying about a billionaire. Courtney stared at me, her mouth hanging open. The sister she had mocked, the sister whose college fund she had drained to buy luxury handbags, was now worth $3 billion. Courtney's entire identity was built on feeling superior to me. She had spent years parading her fake wealth while relying on our parents to bail her out of debt. Now her parents were bankrupt, and the sister she despised held the keys to the entire kingdom. But the most satisfying reaction belonged to Elijah. The arrogant African-American wealth management lawyer who had sneered at me in family court just 24 hours ago was completely paralyzed. His sharp legal mind was desperately trying to process the timeline. He looked at me, his dark eyes wide with absolute horror. He finally connected the dots. He finally realized how the Federal Bureau of Investigation had suddenly acquired his heavily encrypted offshore ledgers. He realized that the high-level cybersecurity system that had bypassed his firewalls and reported his money laundering to the Department of Justice was not a random audit. It was an Aegis Shield tactical deployment. He had tried to steal from the chief executive officer of a $3 billion cyber defense corporation. I sat at the head of the table, watching them drown in their own devastating reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. True power does not need to scream to make an impact. True power simply exists and forces everyone else to submit to its gravity. "Please take a seat, Preston," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "We have a considerable amount of corporate restructuring to handle today, and I do not like to waste my valuable time." Preston Caldwell nodded respectfully and took the seat to my right. Harrison remained standing completely frozen, in a state of absolute catatonic shock. His real estate empire, his reputation, his entire fragile ego had been systematically dismantled and displayed on a conference table for all his minority shareholders to see. He had nothing left. The illusion was dead. I reached out and tapped the sleek glass control panel embedded in the center of the mahogany table. The heavy motorized blackout blinds instantly descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, sealing the executive boardroom in near absolute darkness. A massive high-definition projector screen hummed to life as it lowered slowly from the ceiling directly behind my chair. I did not ask for permission to present my findings. I simply commanded the space. I pulled a highly encrypted titanium flash drive from my suit pocket and inserted it into the console. The enormous screen flickered and then illuminated the dark room with a blinding white light. Complex financial spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and highly classified federal audit logs populated the display. The minority shareholders leaned forward in their leather chairs, their eyes narrowing as they tried to process the sheer volume of data I had just unleashed. "Let us begin with the actual reason this corporation is currently drowning in toxic debt," I said, my voice echoing off the paneled walls. "My father loves to blame the economy. He loves to blame commercial real estate markets. But the truth is much more sinister and sits right at this very table." I pointed a digital laser directly at Elijah. The arrogant lawyer was physically shrinking into his seat. His hands trembled so violently he had to clasp them together in his lap. 3 years ago, Harrison appointed his brilliant son-in-law to act as the primary legal counsel and external wealth management director for this firm. I continued, making sure every shareholder heard the facts clearly. "Elijah convinced you all to route your commercial development funds through his offshore holding companies to minimize corporate tax liabilities. He claimed it was a standard wealth management strategy. It was an absolute lie." I switched the slide to reveal a side-by-side comparison of Elijah's private law firm ledgers and Harrison's corporate accounts. Elijah used this real estate company as a massive washing machine for his illicit clients. He funneled millions of dollars of dirty money from illegal overseas syndicates right into your construction budgets. He artificially inflated your property valuations to hide the cash flow. And when the Federal Bureau of Investigation started getting close, he aggressively siphoned the remaining legitimate capital out of your reserve accounts, leaving this company to absorb the catastrophic federal fallout. The minority shareholders gasped in absolute horror. One of them actually slammed his fist on the table, cursing loudly at the revelation. Elijah squeezed his eyes shut, unable to mount a single legal defense because the digital paper trail was absolutely flawless. I did not give them a single moment to breathe. I immediately clicked to the next slide. An entirely new set of financial documents filled the massive screen. These were not complex offshore ledgers. These were domestic credit card statements, expense reports, and fraudulent vendor invoices. But Elijah did not act alone in bleeding this empire dry, I stated, shifting my piercing gaze to my younger sister. Courtney was already shaking her head, her face pale and streaked with ruined designer makeup. Let us examine the brilliant interior design work of the family golden child. Harrison hired Courtney as the exclusive lead designer for every single commercial property developed by this firm over the past 4 years. She submitted invoices for imported Italian marble custom luxury fixtures and high-end architectural consulting. I highlighted a specific row of expenses in bright red. But Courtney never actually purchased those materials for the commercial builds. She used a network of fake vendor accounts to approve her own invoices. She took millions of dollars straight from the corporate construction budget and funneled it directly into her personal checking accounts. I brought up a split screen showing her fraudulent expense reports right next to her actual credit card purchases. Vivian let out a loud, dramatic sob as she stared at the screen. The money meant to develop your commercial properties was spent on limited edition designer handbags, first-class vacations to Paris, and a fleet of luxury vehicles she used to maintain her fake socialite image on the internet. She literally bought her entire lavish lifestyle using money she stole from her own father's investors. Courtney let out a loud, pathetic wail, covering her face with her hands as the undeniable proof of her relentless greed was broadcast for everyone to see. Harrison stared at the giant projector screen. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute reality of his situation finally crushed him completely. The golden child he had favored his entire life had robbed him blind. The brilliant son-in-law he had paraded around the country club had used him as a criminal shield and destroyed his legacy. His entire business philosophy, his entire worldview was built on a foundation of absolute garbage. Harrison physically collapsed. His knees gave out, and he dropped heavily onto the carpeted floor beside his chair. The proud, arrogant patriarch was completely gone. In his place was a broken, weeping old man. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning his pride in front of his shareholders. He reached out and grabbed the edge of my designer suit jacket, pulling at the expensive fabric with desperate, shaking hands. "Jocelyn, please." Harrison sobbed, his tears soaking into his collar. His voice was a desperate, pathetic whine that echoed pathetically in the dark room. "You have the money. You are a billionaire. You can fix this entire mess. You can pay off the federal fines. You can inject capital and save the company. We are your family, Jocelyn. We share the exact same blood. You cannot just sit there and watch us lose everything we have ever built. I am your father. I am begging you to save us." I looked down at the pathetic man crying at my feet. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no anger, just a cold, sterile emptiness. I reached down and firmly detached his trembling fingers from the fabric of my suit jacket. I stood up tall and reached over to the console. I closed my laptop with a sharp, definitive snap, cutting the projector feed and plunging the front of the room back into shadows. "I did not acquire this company to save it," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal frozen whisper that echoed through the dead, silent boardroom. "I acquired it to personally sign the order to liquidate all its assets." The words hung in the chilling air of the boardroom. The sheer gravity of my statement paralyzed every executive sitting at the mahogany table. I turned my back on my weeping father and strode toward the frosted glass doors. Preston Caldwell followed closely behind me, flanked by his team of liquidators. We left the broken remains of my family entirely to their own miserable devices, but Elijah did not stay to comfort his hysterical wife or his sobbing father-in-law. The moment I exited the room, the arrogant lawyer sprinted toward the secondary emergency stairwell. He knew the financial guillotine had already dropped. He understood that my cyber intelligence unit had handed his encrypted offshore ledgers directly to the federal government. His only instinct was pure, desperate self-preservation. He needed to reach his prestigious downtown law firm to shred whatever physical evidence remained hidden in his personal safe. He burst through the fire exit door and scrambled down the concrete steps, abandoning his designer briefcase in his haste. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket with trembling fingers and aggressively dialed his senior defense attorney. The call went straight to an automated voicemail system. The elite legal community had already caught wind of the federal investigation, and nobody answered the phone for a dead man walking. Elijah burst out of the underground parking garage, driving his luxury sports car with reckless, panicked speed. He wove through the heavy downtown traffic, ignoring red lights and blaring horns. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his dark hands cramped with tension. He was mentally calculating his offshore escape routes, desperately trying to figure out which international accounts had not been frozen by my security protocols. He thought he could salvage a fraction of his illicit wealth and disappear before the federal hammer struck. He was profoundly mistaken. As his sports car screeched around the final city corner onto the pristine avenue housing his corporate law firm, he slammed his foot furiously onto the brake pedal. The tires shrieked against the asphalt, leaving thick black marks on the pavement. The street was entirely blocked off by a fleet of unmarked black government vehicles and flashing police cruisers. A huge crowd of pedestrians had already gathered on the sidewalks, holding up their smartphones to record the unprecedented spectacle. News vans from every major local and national media network were parked illegally on the curbs with their satellite dishes fully deployed. The heavy glass doors of his prestigious law firm were propped wide open and surrounded by bright yellow crime scene tape. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI were swarming the lobby. They carried large plastic evidence bins packed to the brim with physical hard drives, confidential client folders, and encrypted laptops. Elijah sat frozen in the driver's seat of his luxury vehicle, watching the absolute destruction of his professional existence unfold in real time. He tried to throw the car into reverse to flee the scene, but two armed federal agents had already spotted him. They marched swiftly toward his vehicle, their hands resting menacingly on their tactical belts. They flanked the sports car and aggressively tapped on the tinted glass window, demanding he step out. Elijah opened the door, his legs shaking so violently he could barely stand on the pavement. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, completely stripped of his usual slick boardroom arrogance. The lead federal agent stepped forward and flashed a gold badge directly in his face. The agent did not lower his voice or offer the wealthy lawyer any professional courtesy. He recited the charges loudly enough for the surrounding crowd of journalists and curious onlookers to hear every single devastating word. "You are under federal arrest," the agent declared, his voice echoing down the busy street. "You are currently charged with multiple counts of international money laundering, severe corporate wire fraud, and the malicious intentional forgery of a federal intelligence officer's power of attorney. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Elijah opened his mouth to object, to deploy his usual manipulative legal jargon, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The agent grabbed his arms and forcefully spun him around, pressing his chest flat against the expensive, sleek hood of his own luxury sports car. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists signaled the definitive end of his arrogant reign. The agents patted him down, roughly emptying his pockets of his designer wallet and his incessantly ringing cell phone. They pulled him away from his vehicle and marched him directly through the crowd of flashing camera lenses and shouting reporters. Local journalists thrust heavy microphones into his face, demanding answers about the missing millions and the fabricated military documents. Elijah kept his head bowed, staring fixedly at the concrete pavement. His custom-tailored Italian suit was violently wrinkled and pulled tight across his shoulders. The wealthy, sophisticated aura he had spent decades meticulously cultivating was entirely annihilated in a matter of minutes. He was no longer the brilliant corporate lawyer who intimidated vulnerable clients and manipulated the court system for his own overwhelming greed. He was just another exposed, desperate criminal being shoved into the cramped back seat of a federal transport vehicle. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut, trapping him inside a dark, caged reality he could never manipulate his way out of. His partners at the law firm were already turning against him, preparing to offer the federal prosecutors full cooperation in exchange for reduced sentences. The State Bar Association was actively drafting the immediate permanent revocation of his legal license. The cameras continued to flash wildly, capturing his total public humiliation. This footage would be broadcast, cementing his legacy as a pathetic fraud. His prestigious law career, his immense fraudulent wealth, and his unchecked arrogance were permanently destroyed. Courtney fled the corporate building long before Elijah was pinned against his sports car. She did not stay to comfort her weeping father or her catatonic mother. Her survival instinct was entirely built on material consumption. Whenever her fragile reality threatened to crack, she numbed the panic by spending exorbitant amounts of stolen money. She drove her leased luxury vehicle straight to the most exclusive designer boutique in downtown Washington. She needed the immediate validation of fawning retail associates. She walked through the heavy glass doors, demanding a private fitting room and requesting a bottle of sparkling water. Courtney handed over her solid metal platinum credit card without looking at the cashier. She waited for the familiar, satisfying beep of the approval. Instead, the card reader emitted a sharp, aggressive decline tone. The associate frowned and ran the magnetic strip a second time. It declined again. The manager stepped over his fake retail smile, dropping completely. He informed her that the issuing bank had flagged the account for immediate freeze. She dug into her designer purse and produced 3 different backup credit cards linked to her husband's offshore holding accounts. She slammed them onto the glass display counter, demanding they process the transaction manually. Every single card was instantly rejected by the global banking network. The other wealthy patrons in the boutique turned to stare at her, whispering behind their manicured hands. Courtney grabbed her empty purse and practically ran out the front door, her chest heaving with unfamiliar, terrifying public humiliation. She sped back to her sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in the affluent suburbs of Virginia. Her hands shook violently against the leather steering wheel. Her customized cell phone began to vibrate incessantly in the passenger seat. News alerts flashed across the digital screen, showing live aerial footage of her husband's prestigious law firm surrounded by federal agents. The headlines declared Elijah a primary suspect in a massive international money laundering syndicate. Courtney slammed the brakes in her driveway and sprinted up the stone steps to her front door. She bypassed the grand foyer and ran directly up the sweeping spiral staircase to her massive custom-built walk-in closet. She grabbed 2 oversized travel trunks and began frantically tearing designer dresses off their velvet hangers. She fully knew the federal government would freeze cash assets, but she thought she could hide physical luxury goods to sell for survival money later. She tossed limited edition watches, gold bracelets, and rare vintage shoes into the suitcases, moving with the frantic, messy energy of a cornered thief. She thought she had enough time to empty the hidden wall safe and disappear to a luxury hotel under a fake name before the authorities arrived and evade justice forever. The heavy pounding on her front door shattered her desperate escape plan. The knocking was not polite. It was the loud, aggressive strike of law enforcement demanding immediate entry. Courtney froze, dropping a handful of diamond necklaces onto the plush carpet. Before she could even reach the top of the stairs, the front door was forcefully unlocked by the property management company. 6 men wearing dark tactical shirts reading Asset Recovery Task Force flooded into her grand foyer. They were accompanied by a county sheriff holding a thick stack of court-ordered seizure mandates. Courtney screamed from the second-floor landing, demanding they leave her property. The lead recovery agent ignored her hysteria completely. He read the legal mandate aloud, stating that every piece of luxury merchandise purchased with embezzled corporate construction funds was now the legal property of Aegis Shield. The agents did not hesitate. They marched straight past her, up the spiral staircase, and entered her sanctuary. Courtney shrieked and physically tried to block the closet door, but a female deputy firmly moved her aside, warning her that interfering with a court-ordered asset seizure would result in an immediate felony arrest. The recovery team began systematically emptying the massive closet. They cataloged and bagged every single designer handbag, every pair of imported shoes, and every piece of expensive jewelry Courtney had bought using the money she stole from my grandfather's land development budget. Courtney watched her entire identity being packed into clear plastic evidence bins and carried out the front door. She grabbed her cell phone, her hands trembling uncontrollably, and began dialing the numbers of her closest high society friends. She called the wives of state senators and the daughters of real estate tycoons. She begged them for a place to stay, pleading for a temporary loan to hire a defense attorney. Every single call was immediately sent to voicemail or answered with a cold, brutal rejection. Her wealthy friends had already seen the viral news reports detailing the federal raid on Elijah's office and the absolute collapse of her father's company. In their elite circles, financial ruin and federal indictments were highly contagious diseases. They completely severed ties with her, treating her like an absolute pariah. The woman who had spent decades looking down on me for wearing military uniforms was now socially radioactive. The asset recovery agents loaded the last of her stolen treasures into a massive armored transport truck parked in her driveway. The sheriff handed Courtney a formal eviction notice, stating the house was officially foreclosed and she had exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises. Courtney stumbled out onto the manicured front lawn, her designer makeup completely ruined by heavy tears. She collapsed onto the green grass, screaming and thrashing her arms in a pathetic, violent tantrum. She wailed loudly at the top of her lungs, cursing my name and begging for someone to help her. Luxury sedans drove slowly past her house, the wealthy neighbors peering through their tinted windows to watch her spectacular downfall. Nobody stopped their cars. Nobody offered any comfort. They just stared at her pathetic breakdown and kept driving, leaving the spoiled golden child completely alone on the lawn with absolutely nothing left to her name. Harrison remained paralyzed on the floor of the boardroom long after I walked out. The minority shareholders did not offer him a single hand to stand up. Instead, they immediately surrounded him, demanding personal accountability for the massive fraudulent debts he had aggressively hidden from their portfolios. Preston Caldwell stepped forward and coldly informed Harrison that his tenure as chief executive officer was terminated effective immediately. Two large corporate security guards, the exact same men Harrison had furiously tried to weaponize against me just an hour prior, approached him from behind. They stripped him of his executive keycards, his company cell phone, and his digital access fob. Harrison was physically escorted out of the towering glass building he had built his entire arrogant identity around. He stumbled onto the bustling Washington sidewalk, completely disoriented and stripped of all corporate authority. The luxury company car he usually took home had already been repossessed by the fleet management service, leaving him standing on the pavement with absolutely no way to return to his suburban fortress. While Harrison was being unceremoniously thrown out onto the street, Vivian attempted to seek refuge in the only place she felt truly powerful. She ordered a cheap rideshare service and directed the driver straight to the incredibly exclusive McLean Country Club. This was the exact same sunlit terrace where she had spent the previous morning spreading vicious, malicious rumors about my mental health. She walked through the grand mahogany doors, desperately trying to project an aura of unbothered generational wealth. She smoothed down her designer skirt, ignoring the massive coffee stain she had acquired in the boardroom, and marched toward her reserved table overlooking the pristine 18th hole. Vivian ordered a double martini, attempting to steady her violently shaking hands. She looked around the terrace, waiting for her wealthy socialite friends to flock to her side and offer their blind, unwavering support. Nobody came to her table. The wives of the senators and hedge fund managers completely ignored her presence. They turned their chairs slightly away from her direction, whispering furiously among themselves. The news of the massive federal raid on Elijah's law firm and the hostile takeover of Harrison's real estate empire had already permeated the elite gossip networks. In their ruthlessly superficial world, financial insolvency was the ultimate unforgivable sin. Vivian sat entirely alone, her fake smile trembling as she took a slow, desperate sip of her drink. The final blow to her fragile ego did not come from a whispered rumor. It came directly from the president of the country club. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair who usually greeted Vivian with a warm, respectful embrace. Today he marched across the terrace, flanked by the club manager and the head of membership services. His expression was entirely devoid of warmth. He stopped directly in front of Vivian's table, completely blocking her view of the golf course. The surrounding patrons grew dead silent, eagerly leaning in to witness the impending social execution. Vivian, the club president, stated loudly, ensuring his voice carried across the entire patio. "We just received a highly disturbing notification from our primary financial institution. The automatic payment for your monthly membership dues was aggressively rejected by your bank due to insufficient funds. Furthermore, we have been made aware of the severe federal indictments currently surrounding your immediate family and your primary business holdings. Our bylaws strictly prohibit membership for individuals involved in active federal fraud investigations or those experiencing total financial insolvency. Your membership is officially revoked, effective immediately." Vivian choked on her martini, coughing violently into a linen napkin. She stared up at the club president, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. She desperately dug into her expensive leather purse, pulling out 3 different platinum credit cards. She slammed them onto the glass table, begging the manager to run them manually. She promised them this was just a massive banking error caused by a temporary corporate restructuring. The manager did not even reach for the cards. He simply looked down at her with absolute pity and informed her that security was waiting to escort her off the private premises. Vivian was forced to stand up and walk the entire length of the crowded terrace. The wealthy women she had spent decades trying to impress watched her humiliating exit with cold, calculating stares. She had permanently lost her social kingdom. Harrison and Vivian finally reunited in the grand driveway of their massive McLean estate late that afternoon. They had both taken cheap ride shares home, arriving completely defeated and physically exhausted. But their nightmare was not concluding. It was just reaching its absolute climax. The towering wrought iron gates of their mansion were propped wide open. A fleet of commercial moving trucks and several bank-owned vehicles were parked haphazardly across their perfectly manicured lawn. They rushed up the stone steps of their porch, demanding to know what was happening. A senior asset recovery manager representing Aegis Shield stood waiting by the front door, holding a thick clipboard of foreclosure documents. The manager informed them that due to the massive corporate debt default, the bank had immediately executed the cross-collateralization clauses hidden deep within Harrison's commercial loans. The McLean estate had been leveraged against the failing business multiple times to secure cash for Courtney's lavish lifestyle. Since Aegis Shield now owned the corporate debt, my company officially owned the house. The recovery agents did not allow Vivian to pack her imported Italian furniture or her expensive oil paintings. They did not allow Harrison to access his custom-built wine cellar or his collection of vintage watches. Every single item of value in that house was legally seized to offset the millions of dollars Courtney and Elijah had embezzled from the corporate accounts. The agents handed Harrison and Vivian exactly 2 cheap plastic suitcases. They were instructed to pack only basic, unbranded clothing and essential toiletries. Vivian wept hysterically as she was forced to leave behind decades of accumulated luxury. Harrison simply stared at the floor, completely broken by the swiftness of his absolute ruin. An hour later, the heavy mahogany front doors slammed shut behind them, and the deadbolts were permanently changed. Harrison and Vivian stood on the edge of the public sidewalk right outside the boundaries of the estate they used to proudly command. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, cold shadows across the neighborhood. They each held a flimsy rolling suitcase packed with cheap generic sweaters and basic shoes. They had absolutely no cash, no active credit lines, and no wealthy friends willing to answer their desperate phone calls. The arrogant patriarch, who had ruthlessly disowned me for choosing a military career, and the superficial mother who had called me a pathetic failure, were now officially homeless. They stood on the concrete pavement, shivering in the cool evening air, watching the security team lock the heavy iron gates on their entire ruined existence. 72 hours after the asset recovery, agents locked the heavy iron gates of their McLean estate forever. Harrison and Vivian dragged their cheap plastic suitcases across the polished marble floor of my residential building. I lived in a highly secured, ultra-luxury high-rise located in the most exclusive sector of downtown Arlington. The lobby was an absolute fortress of mirrored glass, brushed steel, and towering modern art installations. It was guarded by an elite private security team that catered exclusively to international diplomats and tech billionaires. My parents looked entirely out of place in this pristine environment. Their generic, unbranded clothing was heavily wrinkled, and their posture was completely shattered. They approached the imposing concierge desk with a forced, desperate humility they had never once displayed in their entire arrogant lives. Vivian unzipped the front pocket of her flimsy luggage and pulled out a faded leather-bound photo album. It was a highly calculated theatrical prop. She had specifically chosen to save that album from the foreclosure, knowing she would need it for this exact manipulation tactic. She opened the album to a picture of me when I was 8 years old, standing in our old suburban backyard. She slammed the book onto the polished marble counter and begged the stern security guard to call my penthouse suite. She performed a masterful display of maternal heartbreak, weeping openly and loudly, proclaiming that they just wanted to see their beloved, successful daughter. Harrison stood right behind her, nodding pitifully and telling the armed guards that family must always stick together during a financial crisis. They desperately wanted to move into my spare guest rooms. They honestly believed that a few nostalgic photographs and some fake tears could magically erase decades of severe emotional abuse and relentless financial exploitation. I did not step onto the private elevator. I did not walk down to the grand lobby to look them in the eye. I sat comfortably on the oversized leather sofa inside my 50th floor penthouse, watching their entire pathetic performance unfold through the high-definition security cameras broadcasting directly to my encrypted tablet. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my vintage red wine. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no lingering childhood attachment to the two strangers weeping on the ground floor. I simply picked up my secure phone and authorized my legal team to execute the final termination protocol. The silver doors of the private elevator chimed and parted smoothly. Preston Caldwell stepped into the bright lobby. He wore the exact same immaculate navy pinstripe suit he had worn when he dismantled my father's real estate empire in the corporate boardroom. Preston walked briskly toward the concierge desk, carrying a sleek black leather folder. Harrison and Vivian immediately turned toward him, their eyes lighting up with frantic delusional hope. They genuinely thought Preston was coming down to escort them up to my penthouse. They reached for the plastic handles of their cheap suitcases, eagerly preparing to ascend into my luxurious world and leech off my wealth. Preston did not offer a polite handshake. He stopped exactly 4 feet away from my parents, maintaining a cold, sterile professional distance. He opened the leather folder and extracted a thick, legally binding contract, placing it firmly on the marble counter, right over Vivian's stupid manipulative photo album. He pulled a heavy silver pen from his jacket pocket and laid it precisely next to the document. "Madam Chairman will not be coming down to receive you," Preston stated, his voice echoing with absolute chilling authority across the quiet lobby. "She has, however, authorized me to present you with a singular, non-negotiable offer. You are currently entirely insolvent. You have 0 active credit lines, no viable assets, and you are facing imminent homelessness on the streets of Arlington. My client is willing to provide a highly monitored, irrevocable living stipend. You will receive exactly $2,000 on the first day of every single month." Harrison stared at Preston as if the lawyer had just slapped him violently across the face. $2,000? Harrison gasped, his voice cracking with sheer indignation and offended pride. "That barely covers the cost of a basic dinner at the country club. We cannot possibly survive on that pathetic amount. We need a place to live. We need direct access to Jocelyn. We are her parents and she owes us a proper lifestyle. That stipend is precisely enough to rent a very modest one-bedroom apartment in the run-down industrial district on the outskirts of the city, Preston countered sharply, shutting down Harrison's arrogant complaint instantly. It will cover your basic utility bills and generic groceries from a discount supermarket. It is a strict survival fund, not a luxury allowance to fund your delusions. But accepting this money comes with absolute ironclad legal conditions. Preston tapped the signature line on the heavy parchment document. By signing this agreement, you formally and legally sever all parental rights and familial claims to Jocelyn and her vast corporate assets. Furthermore, this contract serves as a permanent binding lifetime restraining order. You are legally prohibited from ever approaching her private residence, her corporate offices, or her person within a 100-meter radius. You will never attempt to contact her by phone, email, or through any third-party proxies. If you violate this spatial boundary even once the monthly stipend is permanently terminated, and you will be immediately arrested for criminal harassment and trespassing. Vivian began to sob hysterically, clutching her chest as the brutal reality of the legal document sank in. She looked wildly up at the security cameras mounted in the corners of the lobby, knowing full well I was watching her every move. She pleaded directly with the camera lens, begging me to remember the good times, begging me to show mercy to my own flesh and blood. But she was begging a brick wall. I watched her tears fall onto the marble counter, feeling nothing but a profound sense of closure. You have exactly 60 seconds to sign the agreement, Preston warned, checking his expensive wristwatch with total apathy. If you refuse, I will instruct the armed security team to forcefully remove you from the premises, and you will sleep on the freezing concrete sidewalk tonight with absolutely nothing to your names. Harrison looked at his weeping wife. He looked at their cheap plastic luggage and the cold, dark street waiting just outside the revolving glass doors. His colossal pride was completely shattered. The arrogant real estate tycoon had been violently reduced to a desperate beggar facing the harsh elements. With violently trembling hands, Harrison picked up the heavy silver pen. He swallowed his bitter tears and signed his name on the dotted line, officially signing away his daughter for a pitiful monthly survival allowance. Vivian took the pen next her hand, shaking so violently she could barely form the cursive letters. She signed her parental rights away, weeping uncontrollably over the faded photo album she had tried to weaponize against me. I stood up from my leather sofa and walked toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my penthouse. I looked down from the 50th floor, watching two tiny, insignificant figures drag their rolling suitcases out of the brightly lit lobby and into the freezing darkness of the city streets. They walked away carrying the heavy, crushing burden of their own immense greed and toxicity. I raised my crystal glass of wine to the empty, expansive room, taking a long, deeply satisfying drink. The poison was finally and surgically extracted from my life. I had officially cut every single toxic blood tie, and I had never felt more completely, powerfully alive. Exactly 12 months had passed since I stood on the 50th floor of my penthouse and watched my parents walk into the freezing darkness. Aegis Shield had quadrupled its federal contracts during that time. I was no longer just a billionaire on paper. I was an untouchable titan in the global cybersecurity sector. But there was one final piece of unfinished business I needed to handle to completely close the darkest chapter of my life. I walked into the grand ballroom of the Arlington National Bank holding facility, wearing a sharp black trench coat and dark sunglasses. The room was packed with wealthy real estate scavengers and aggressive property flippers. They were all holding numbered bidding paddles, eagerly waiting to capitalize on the high-profile foreclosures of the year. The crown jewel of the morning auction was the massive McLean estate. It was the exact same sprawling suburban fortress where I had endured decades of psychological abuse. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium and announced the opening bid for my childhood home. Several aggressive developers immediately raised their paddles, sparking a rapid, fierce bidding war. The price quickly climbed past the market value, driven by the sheer prestige of the neighborhood. I did not join the frantic early rounds. I stood silently at the back of the room, waiting for the crowd to exhaust their capital. When the bidding finally slowed and a smug developer in a gray suit smirked, thinking he had secured the property, I slowly raised my paddle. I casually called out a cash bid that was a full $2 million over his final offer. The entire ballroom whipped around to stare at me in absolute stunned silence. The arrogant developer lowered his paddle, his face flushing with defeat. The auctioneer slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the podium, echoing the finality of the transaction. I walked straight to the administrative desk and signed the cashier check without a single hesitation. I had just purchased my own childhood prison. 2 hours later, I drove my armored luxury SUV through the towering wrought iron gates of the McLean estate. The property had been sitting completely vacant for an entire year. The perfectly manicured lawns that Vivian used to obsess over were now overgrown with thick, aggressive weeds. The ornate fountain in the center of the circular driveway was completely dry and stained with dark green algae. I parked my vehicle and unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors, stepping into the grand foyer. The air inside was stale and suffocatingly still. The bank had stripped the house of all the furniture to pay off Elijah and Courtney's massive fraudulent debts, but the architectural bones of the mansion remained completely intact. I walked slowly through the empty, echoing rooms, letting the painful memories surface one final time before I eradicated them permanently. I stepped into the massive formal dining room, where Harrison had constantly berated my military salary and demanded I sign away my $45 million federal contract. I walked up the sweeping spiral staircase, where Vivian used to pose for pathetic society magazines, trying to project an image of flawless, aristocratic wealth. But the most repulsive aspect of the house was not the memories. It was the physical architecture itself. Courtney had styled herself as a luxury interior designer, using the money she embezzled from my grandfather's development budget to completely renovate the estate. Her taste was an absolute vulgar display of unearned new money. She had plastered the walls with tacky imported Italian marble that violently clashed with cheap gold-plated trim. She had installed massive gaudy crystal chandeliers in rooms with low ceilings, making the spaces feel cramped and overwhelmingly pretentious. She had ripped out the original beautiful hardwood floors and replaced them with glossy, slippery white tiles that looked like they belonged in a cheap shopping mall. She had bolted fake European columns to the interior archways, desperately trying to manufacture a sense of royal heritage that our family completely lacked. Every single room was a physical manifestation of her shallow, greedy, and entirely superficial personality. The house was a monument to their collective arrogance and their absolute lack of substance. It was toxic down to the very foundation. I did not buy this massive estate to live in it. I did not buy it to renovate it or flip it for a profit. I bought it to execute a total and uncompromising physical cleansing. I walked back out the front doors and stood on the overgrown lawn, breathing in the cool morning air. A low, heavy mechanical rumbling began to vibrate through the ground beneath my combat boots. A convoy of massive yellow industrial excavators and heavy-duty bulldozers rolled through the iron gates. I had hired the most aggressive demolition crew in the state of Virginia, paying them triple their usual daily rate to expedite the process. The crew foreman, a burly man in a bright orange safety vest, jumped down from his truck and jogged over to me holding a clipboard. He asked me if I wanted to salvage any of the expensive marble or the gold fixtures before they started the teardown. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him I wanted every single inch of the structure reduced to unrecognizable rubble. I wanted it turned into absolute dust. The foreman nodded sharply and blew a loud, sharp whistle. The massive diesel engines roared to life, filling the quiet suburban neighborhood with a glorious, deafening thunder. I stood on the edge of the property line, my arms crossed over my chest, and watched the destruction begin. The largest excavator raised its heavy steel claw high into the air and brought it crashing down onto the roof of the master bedroom. The violent impact shattered the terracotta tiles and snapped the wooden support beams like fragile twigs. A massive plume of gray dust and debris exploded into the sky. The metal claw swung again, ripping through the side of the house and tearing down Courtney's fake European columns with effortless, brutal power. I watched the gaudy crystal chandeliers crash onto the glossy white tiles, shattering into millions of useless, jagged pieces. The massive bay windows exploded outward, raining shattered glass across the dead lawn. The bulldozer plowed directly through the front porch, crushing the grand mahogany doors into splinters. The noise was absolutely deafening, but to me it sounded like a beautiful, flawless symphony. I smiled a wide, genuine smile as I watched the walls of my childhood prison collapse inward. Every time a wooden beam snapped, I felt a heavy, suffocating weight lift directly off my shoulders. Every time the steel claw tore through the tacky Italian marble, I felt decades of psychological abuse being physically, violently eradicated from the earth. The air was thick with dirt and pulverized concrete, but I took a deep cleansing breath. It was a complete, absolute visual and emotional purification. I was entirely free. 18 months after the heavy steel excavators crushed my childhood prison into dust, the property was completely unrecognizable. The gaudy fake European columns and cheap imported marble were erased. In their place stood a breathtaking architectural masterpiece of reinforced steel, sleek obsidian glass, and sustainable concrete. I personally designed every inch to reflect absolute strength and uncompromising purpose. It was no longer a suburban fortress built to hide a deeply broken family. It was now officially commissioned as the Aegis Shield Vanguard Center. This state-of-the-art facility was a dedicated career transition and elite cybersecurity training academy built for female military veterans. I personally poured millions of dollars into creating a sanctuary for women who had served their country and needed a specialized path into the civilian corporate sector. The campus featured advanced server laboratories, encrypted coding classrooms, and comprehensive psychological support suites. I completely transformed the exact physical location of my deepest childhood trauma into a powerful, permanent launching pad for absolute female empowerment. I walked slowly through the wide, brightly lit corridors of the main training hub. The air hummed with the quiet, intense energy of absolute focus. Dozens of highly trained women sat behind glowing holographic monitors, executing complex threat matrices and learning to dismantle global cyber syndicates. They wore sharp professional attire instead of combat fatigues, but they carried the exact same lethal discipline they had forged in the military. There was no toxic competition here. There was no desperate gaslighting or pathetic manipulation for parental approval. These women did not demand unearned handouts, and they did not steal from each other to fund superficial lifestyles. They operated with ruthless efficiency and unbreakable mutual respect. As I moved through the facility, several women looked up from their workstations and offered me sharp, respectful nods. They respected me because I had stood in the exact same trenches they had, and I built this entire empire to ensure they would never be left behind. This was my true bloodline. This was the family I meticulously chosen and actively built. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, leading out to the expansive wraparound balcony on the top floor of the administrative wing. The cool evening breeze swept across the property, carrying the fresh, clean scent of the nearby Virginia forests. The warm evening sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant fiery orange and deep violet glow across the distant horizon. I walked to the edge of the sleek metal railing, holding a crystal glass of vintage red wine. I rested my hand against the cool steel, looking down at the pristine campus below. I was joined on the balcony by my 3 top executive lieutenants. These were women who had served directly alongside me during my most dangerous overseas deployments. They were brilliant, fearless, and fiercely loyal. We did not need to exchange meaningless, superficial pleasantries. We understood the profound gravity of what we had achieved together. We raised our crystal glasses in the fading sunlight, silently toasting to our hard-fought independence, our unbreakable sisterhood, and our absolute total victory. We stepped back inside the luxurious executive lounge as the evening chill began to settle. On the far wall, a massive flat-screen monitor was broadcasting a national evening news network. I usually kept the news feeds muted, but today a specific breaking headline caught my immediate attention. I gestured for one of my lieutenants to turn up the volume. The news anchor stared gravely into the camera, detailing the spectacular conclusion of one of the most high-profile federal fraud cases of the decade. The screen shifted to broadcast live footage from outside the federal courthouse in downtown Washington. I watched intently as Elijah was escorted down the concrete steps by two armed United States Marshals. The arrogant wealth management lawyer was completely unrecognizable. He was no longer wearing his custom-tailored Italian suits or his expensive luxury watches. He was wearing an oversized bright orange federal prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy metal chains that clanked loudly against the pavement. The national news anchor delivered the final definitive verdict with absolute cold journalistic precision. Elijah had just been officially sentenced to 10 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. The broadcast detailed his catastrophic downfall, explaining how his money laundering syndicate and malicious forgery of military documents had earned him the maximum penalty under federal guidelines. The anchor also briefly mentioned the total liquidation of his father-in-law's real estate empire, serving as a pathetic cautionary tale of corporate greed and absolute financial ruin. I watched Elijah duck his head, trying desperately to hide his face from the aggressive barrage of flashing camera lenses. He looked completely defeated, thoroughly broken, and devoid of his former supreme arrogance. He was stepping into a dark, suffocating cage that he had built with his own two hands. He would spend the next entire decade of his life securely locked in a freezing concrete cell, entirely stripped of his name, his power, and his stolen wealth. I stared at the monitor, absorbing the sheer magnitude of my total victory. I felt no lingering anger. I felt absolutely no regret. The scales of my life were now permanently flawlessly balanced. I picked up the sleek black remote control resting on the glass coffee table. I pressed the power button with a sharp, definitive click. The massive screen instantly faded to pitch black, shutting out the pathetic ghosts of my deeply toxic past forever. I turned my back to the empty monitor. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my vintage red wine, tasting the flavor of absolute victory. I listened to the bright, genuine laughter of my comrades echoing from the adjacent hallway. I smiled a wide, genuinely fearless smile and walked confidently forward to join them. I was completely unburdened, totally untouchable, and boldly stepping directly into a brilliantly radiant and infinitely free future. The most profound lesson we can extract from this story is that biology does not automatically guarantee loyalty, respect, or unconditional love. For decades, Jocelyn was subjected to relentless emotional abuse and severe financial manipulation by the exact people who were socially expected to protect her. Society frequently pressures us to forgive and endure toxic family dynamics simply because individuals share our DNA. However, this narrative entirely shatters that dangerous myth. Blood may make people your relatives, but consistent mutual respect is what actually defines a true family. Jocelyn taught us that the ultimate response to gaslighting and narcissism is never engaging in desperate screaming matches or seeking validation from those completely incapable of giving it. Real power lies in silent, meticulous preparation and the relentless pursuit of your own absolute independence. While her toxic relatives wasted their entire lives curating fake socialite images and plotting deceitful schemes, she focused on acquiring undeniable skills and building a legitimate, untouchable empire. When the pivotal moment arrived to defend herself, she did not need to beg for her humanity to be recognized. She simply presented cold, hard facts and established permanent, ironclad boundaries. Furthermore, true healing does not always require reconciliation. Sometimes the healthiest and most empowering choice is total, unapologetic severance. By bulldozing the physical monument of her childhood trauma and replacing it with a powerful sanctuary for female veterans, Jocelyn proved that we hold the ultimate authority to rewrite our own legacy. You do not have to carry the heavy toxic baggage of your abusers. You can completely demolish it and build something brilliant, purposeful, and infinitely free in its place. If you have ever had to break toxic family cycles to protect your peace and build your own empire, share your story of triumph in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering content.